Lucas, are you going to do this one? Josh? Thank you very much, Chief Clerk. We'll now call the meeting to order. The next bill for our consideration is LSO 97, Working Draft .2, School District Trustee Oath of Office. Mr. Anderson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yeah, Josh Anderson, LSO. This bill was requested at our May meeting. The Secretary of State's office had identified a potential conflict in a statute. So this bill clarifies when a school district trustee is required to take the oath of office. Their terms begin on December 1st. So it just goes in and amends the statute to say on or before the first day of December after receiving notification of their election or within 10 days after receiving notification of appointment, they're required to take the oath of office to be a school district trustee. That's the bill, Mr. Chairman. Take any questions.
Any questions for Mr. Anderson? Thank you, Mr. Anderson. Mr. Secretary, I think this came from your office. And it has to do with the situation where people are appointed, right? I yield to you.
Yes. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm Chuck Ray, the Wyoming Secretary of State, and to my right is Joe Rubino, our Policy Director and Counsel. Thank you for undertaking our requested bill draft motion to clear up the inconsistency between Wyoming Statute 22-22-102 and Wyoming Statute 21-3-106. The conflict which created an ambiguity in which an elected trustee's term begins on December 1st under one statute, but within 10 days of the election under the other statute is fully addressed by amending 21-3-106 such that a trustee who is elected assumes their oath of their office and takes their oath on December 1st, while those appointed take their oath within 10 days, which is our speculation on actually how the discrepancy happened, that the 10 days was for the appointed situation. Unless there are any questions, we have no suggestions of the draft language. I want to thank the committee and LSO for their work.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary.
Thank
Any
you.
questions for the Secretary? Seeing none, thank you. Anybody else want to weigh in? Anybody in the audience? Anybody online? Committee, you've heard testimony, which was none, except for the Secretary of State's office. What's your pleasure? Motion by the co-chairman. Is there a second? Second by good Representative Chadwick. Discussion. Seeing no discussion, I'll call for the question. It's going to be a roll call vote. Katie, please call a roll. This is the way you run an afternoon.
Yeah. Glad you got the easy ones.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman. This is roll call vote for 24 LSO 0097, School District Trustee Oath of Office. Senator Barlow. Senator Boner. Senator Landon. Senator Scott. Representative Chadwick. Representative Harrelson. Representative Harshman. Representative Knapp. Representative Newsom. Representative Ottman. Representative Wiley. Representative Yin. Co-Chairman Olson. Chairman Case.
Aye.
14-0.
Thank you very much. It's passed the committee. Be for introduction. Mr. Anderson, how about teeing us up for LSO 98, Working Draft .4, Political Party Affiliation Declaration and Changes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Again, Josh Anderson, LSO. This bill also came out of our May meeting with discussions around the changes to political party affiliation changes and declarations. Specifically, the idea was to make sure we're not limiting first-time electors in Wyoming from declaring their party. As we worked in drafting this, we came to the question of what would happen if someone was in Wyoming, 20 years ago, and then came back, and would they be considered a first-time elector? So we used a time period in here. I do want to call the committee's attention to that. Certainly a policy choice there. And as I get into this, I'll note that specifically, you'll see the first change on page 2 there, that the previous bill had limited the ability of an elector to cancel their registration. This bill would have stricken that. Then further on page 2 on line 11, an elector may change their party affiliation on an existing registration by completing an application signed by a notarial officer on the first day on which application for nomination may be filed. And then the new language beginning on line 15, if a qualified elector who was not registered to vote in Wyoming during the immediately preceding 12-month period. And again, here, another date could be used. One that I had considered was the date of the immediately preceding general election or primary election. And again, there's different ways to do this, but this is the way we came up with. If that person registers to vote in Wyoming prior to the date of the primary election, they may declare their party affiliation on the date of that registration by completing an application signed by a notarial before a notarial officer and filing with the county clerk. And then any additional changes would be done in compliance with that section. That's the bill, Mr. Chairman. I take any questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Anderson. Any questions for Mr. Anderson? Any questions? Not seeing any. Thanks a lot, Josh. Mr. Secretary?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm Chuck Gray, the Wyoming Secretary of State, and I'm joined to my right by Joe Rubino, our Policy Director and Counsel. After a thorough review of the proposed bill related to political party affiliation, declaration, and changes, I wanted to offer a few thoughts, concerns, and an amendment to further effectuate both the intent of the legislature and our office's ongoing duty to effectively implement legislation. First, a little bit of background. When House Enrolled Act 70, Political Party Affiliation, Declaration, and Changes, was passed and allowed to become law, our office, in conjunction with county clerks from Albany County, Sublette County, Fremont County, and Carbon County, immediately began working with our Wyoming voter registry list vendor to modify our electronic WyoReg and WyoReg e-poll book system to accommodate the legislation. And again, as we use the term WyoReg, that is our Wyoming voter registry list. These changes included, but were not limited to, restricting the ability of registered voters to change party affiliation within the time period between the first day of candidate filing and the date of the primary, and preventing registered electors from canceling their registration during the time period prescribed by statute in order to fix what was identified as the cancellation loophole, in which electors who would otherwise be stopped from changing their party affiliation from simply canceling with the intent to re-register and change their party affiliation. In conjunction with the original intent of the legislation and based on our interpretation of the statute, I want to be clear that the Secretary of State's office and the county clerk's implementation and preparation would not prevent new registrants from registering and affiliating with a political party during the time period between the first day of candidate filing and the date of the primary election. And don't want to speak for the clerks, but we've been in agreement with this when this came up during the session. I'm sure they're going to come up, and I'm preparing formal guidance. So whether or not this bill passes, that we're going to have formal guidance that this does not apply to new registrants. Okay, this is this is applying to switches after the lockout period. Again, I want to emphasize that the technical requirements, which were set to go into production by the end of January 2024, would stop crossover voting without preventing new registrants from declaring party affiliation during that time period. And again, our office is currently working on formal guidance to this effect. However, as I said at the Joint Corporations meeting in May, I have always been open to ensuring that the intent of the original legislation and the way it is being implemented is further clarified. As we originally discussed, this largely centered on changing the use of elector in 22-5-214 to qualified elector to ensure that qualified electors defined in statute as those already registered to vote would be prohibited from changing party affiliation during the prescribed period, while mere electors or new registrants would not be prohibited from registering and affiliating with a party. Based on what we have seen, I have many concerns that the LSO draft as written has wide-reaching ramifications which have not been fully fleshed out and which require amendments by the committee. So switching gears here now into the next section, want to highlight specifically our issues with the proposed language, and there's two of them. First, the language could be read to completely obliterate the cancellation requirement by reinstating the cancellation loophole in 22-3-115. As the language reads, it restores the cancellation loophole. What's more, the plain text of the language provides that a qualified elector who was not registered to vote in Wyoming during the immediately preceding 12-month period may declare party affiliation on the date of registration, but does not expressly prohibit a qualified elector who was registered to vote in Wyoming during the immediately preceding 12-month period from changing party affiliation. Even if by inference it did prevent a qualified elector from registering to vote if they were registered, there are still problems with this provision. Namely, if interpreted that way, it may be too broad in its application and actually prevent new registrants from declaring, even if they would otherwise be able to, as the statute currently reads. It also uses qualified elector to refer to electors who potentially have not registered, thus in conflict with the statutory definition of qualified elector. Second, there are major technical ramifications which will severely alter the Secretary of State's and county clerk's current implementation of the original legislation. As mentioned earlier, in coordination with the county clerks, our office has already completed the complex process of writing technical requirements for our WyoReg system by working with our vendor to ensure the changes can be deployed for the 2024 election cycle. This includes, but is not limited to, implementing and testing the technical requirements to prevent voters from canceling their registration by request during the period prohibited in statute. Changing back, in addition to the changes required to implement this new scheme, would frustrate both the original intent of the legislation as well as the technical implementation, which raises many problems during an election cycle in addition to added costs. As the Secretary of State's office has and continues to have a strong policy against implementing new technical notifications to the WyoReg voter registration system after February 1st of an election year wherever possible. As such, our office has drafted amendments to the LSO draft as well as language that has been tracked in, which if permitted, we will hand out to the committee now. I think you have handed that out.
I think you must be permitted because we already.
Yeah.
have it.
So you guys have the tracked in and then also the
We
amendment.
do.
The first handout contains the language as tracked in. This language reverts back to get rid of the cancellation loophole in 22-3-115 and contains changes which solidify the original intent of the bill, namely that new registrants would not be prevented from registering and declaring their party affiliation during the prescribed period. By inserting qualified before elector and providing language in 22-5-214 that ensures that nothing in the subsection shall prohibit an elector who is not registered to vote in Wyoming after the first day on which an application for nomination may be filed under 22-5-209 from registering and declaring a party affiliation before the next primary election, the original intent of the bill will be made ever more clear. So in conclusion, and I think you all know this, I'm very in support of the crossover bill change we made in that last session. It was our number one priority, and we thank the legislature for helping us get that to the finish line. And I want to reemphasize my support to end crossover voting and do it in the right way. I appreciate the work of the committee and LSO staff in attempting to clarify. However, I do believe with our formal guidance, which we will have completed by the next meeting in November, this truly is not necessary. However, if you decide to proceed, we ask you to add in that amendment, and otherwise the bill does something that's totally different in terms of what I believe the intent was when we discussed making it clearer in the statute. And that's I believe the direction we should go. So thanks.
Thank you very much, Mr. Secretary.
Thank you.
Questions for Mr. Secretary? Senator Barlow.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Secretary Gray, when you say the guidance will be complete the next committee meeting, which a month or two from now, is that guidance going to go through a rulemaking process or is this something else? Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Secretary.
Mr. Chairman, we're still establishing whether we believe it needs to go through a rulemaking, but our initial readout is no. It's along the line of a policy guidance, which is, it's not an interpretation of a statute. And obviously, if it was the second, then we'd be in the middle of that at your next meeting.
Good. Anybody? Senator Scott. Microphone, Senator Scott.
Mr. Chairman, in the proposed amendment, the last phrase of it reads declaring a party affiliation before the next primary election. How would you feel about that reading before or at the next primary election so that somebody who is unregistered could register at the primary and declare a party affiliation at that time?
Ms. Secretary. Mr. Rubino.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Senator Scott, if I'm understanding you correctly, that change would just clarify that if you were a new registrant,
Mhm.
you would be able to come to on the day of the election and then
Same
register
day
to
of
vote.
registration.
Yep, absolutely. I think that'd be great. That'd be a good.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, I think that tracking that
Mr.
in.
Secretary.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The last clause, yeah, that's just on the same day. It's the same intent. Thank you.
Thank you. Anybody else? Senator Landon.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So, Mr. Secretary, at the end of your remarks, you indicated, I think, if I heard correctly, and I want to make sure that I'm tracking with you, you indicated that you didn't really think this bill was necessary. We didn't need this language of clarification. I'm wondering if that is the hinge point for all the emails that we've been getting, which a lot of folks got pretty lathered up about this. So I want to make sure that everyone who's listening in from around the state and those in the room today know exactly where we are with this legislation. What we're trying to fix is that loophole, which would allow people, particularly right before the primary, to register for the first time. But I thought that you indicated, Mr. Secretary, that we still really don't need that legislation. Can you clarify that for me?
Ms. Secretary, and I think he's referring to the possibility of cancellation or which comes in to undo the bill. But go to you, Ms. Secretary.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, thank you for that question. And I really appreciate it because I know the comments were long and pretty technical and I want to give the overall view here and make sure we're on the same page. We have believed from the beginning, from when, you brought that amendment on first reading that was then reversed, that the bill as written, and that bill was never amended in the legislature, was operable through the entire process. Okay. And we still believe that. The clerks, don't want to speak for them, but we've had multiple meetings and they have asserted in very official meetings that they agree with that. There were a number, obviously with the concerns, we want to address them if we can. And there was always this question of whether we come back and do a bill or whether we just do a policy guidance. What I am saying is we are preparing the policy guidance. It will be done by your next meeting. I think the bill stands on it. The current statute stands on its own anyway, but that policy guidance will be there. It will be very clear and it will be reviewed with the clerks. And we believe that that further fixes what is already operable, meaning that this legislation on its face would not be needed. However, if you decide that you want a statutory fix on this question, the language as written does not do that. It reopens the cancellation loophole. And that's what the amendment we're trying to get at fixes. So it's kind of a two-pronged deal. Thank you.
So,
Senator Landon, follow up.
thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just as a follow-up then, so when we get directives from headquarters, it says it is not to be amended. This is a piece of legislation that people are trying to do nefarious things to. That's really not the case. And I just want to make sure that everyone understands all we're trying to do. And I think that last endorsement that you gave is to try to clarify, make sure that everyone knows this is not for first-time registrants. We're trying to make sure that people can declare and vote in the primary. So, that directive that I read in an email, I think yesterday, day before, was under no circumstances do we amend anything. And so I'm just trying to get down to clarification on that and appreciate, Mr. Secretary, your
Thank you.
comments. So
If you were to ask me,
Mr.
Mr. Chairman,
Mr.
oh,
Secretary,
thank
gotta
you.
go
Thank
through
you,
the
Mr. Chairman. Yes. Mr. Chairman, if you were to ask me which of the two procedures I would prefer for us to keep it as it is, not reopen it, do the guidance. The clerks and I, we're in agreement anyway, even without the guidance. The guidance will further elucidate that. But if you are going to proceed, then I want to get it right. But if you're asking me which of the two ways forward do I prefer, it would be for us to not reopen this. Obviously, you reopen it and, anything can happen. So I think that's why there's some concern there. And I would prefer for us to just let it stand. But I understand, and we're engaging in good faith with the committee. So we also brought an amendment. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Secretary. Anybody else? Anybody else have questions for the Secretary of State? Thank you. Let's hear from the clerks that we've talked so much about. It's always interesting to see if Mr. Irwin comes up by himself or if he has an entourage. He is coming by himself. Mr. Irwin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Sometimes the sacrificial lamb has to go by themselves. My name is Malcolm Urban. I'm the Platte County Clerk and the President of the Clerks Association. We support the Secretary of State's amendment. One thing we found concerning about the draft language was this 12-month period where the election judge would have to sort through when was your registration canceled. And for those counties who do not have e-poll books, that means in a paper poll book, when the elector presents themselves, they won't have the information of when they were last registered and at what point their registration was canceled. And so that created a significant problem for election day registrations. And so for that reason, we support that amendment, Mr. Chairman. And then we would just ask that it be effective immediately. Again, I don't know that necessarily makes a significant change on this bill, but anything election related, we'd like to have it done ahead of time before we're in the throes of the election. That's all we have, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Are there questions for Mr. Irvin?
Yeah.
Mr. Co-Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So Clerk Irvin, can you speak to the secretary's comments about the guidance and the conversations that the clerk's office has had with the Secretary of State's office?
Mr. Irvin.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Olson, when House Bill 103 passed both bodies and went to the governor's office, we were asked to attend a meeting with the governor's office and the Secretary of State's office about how the bill would be administered. And in that meeting, we did state that the 23 county clerks, as we heard the testimony, understood the bill, that the intent was for the currently registered voters within that county, they would not be able to change. We look at the voter registration as a county database and not necessarily a statewide database. So we were very clear, if somebody moves from Converse to Platte County, that's a new registration in Platte County. And at that point, that new registrant would be able to declare their party. And so, Mr. Chairman, based off our conversations, I think the Secretary explained it well, which was the way we intended to proceed with this bill was for actively registered voters within our county. Starting on the day of candidate filing, we would not allow that voter to change, but we would allow new registrants to declare. I hope that clarifies, Mr. Co-Chairman.
Anybody else? Representative Harrelson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Malcolm, so with that, let me ask this question. Do you believe that we need any of this language, or do you believe that as it currently stands, that it is something that your office could carry out, or do you believe that we need the amended draft to help make that reality?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Haroldson, I think that amended language is good, and for the purpose of the current 23 county clerks, the current Secretary of State, that's how we interpret and we understand the intent of the bill. To make it expressly clear to the next 23 county clerks, I think that could certainly use some clarification, whether legislative through rule. So, Mr. Chairman, I do believe some clarification is warranted.
So just to drive it home, you prefer to have a bill over not have a bill, and you're speaking for the association.
Mr. Chairman, when we met in that meeting with the governor's office and the Secretary of State's office, we walked away from that thinking that the primary fix would just be clean up language within the statute itself. And so we think that with the language the Secretary of State's office has proposed, that it would be a fine change and welcomed by the association.
And so the 1-2 punch is you welcome the changes to the draft proposed by the secretary, and you also support the bill in the end.
Mr. Chairman, yes on both questions.
Okay. Anybody else? Anybody else? Thank you, Mr.
Yep,
Irvin.
thank you.
Is there anybody in the audience who'd like to testify? Ms. Simmons. And how is the online looking? Got 2? Peace. Yeah, let them both in. That way they won't miss the public testimony. Ms. Simmons, welcome.
Welcome. Chairman, I am Gail Simmons, Civics 307. And I provided you like a decision tree. And the idea being that the express purpose of that bill that was passed was to close the loophole, was to make it so that individuals who are already registered, which means they have an entry into a database called WildReg, that once we get to the blackout period, that they cannot cancel or unregister in order to get around that. And so I think everybody's in agreement that that is a loophole that regardless of how often it would be used, it's a loophole worth closing. And the concern always was that because of the way the language was written in that particular statute, and now looking at the proposal from the Secretary of State, I'd like to point out, Mr. Chairman, that everything that you do in the legislature has at least 2 audiences. One of them are the people who have to administer the changes that are made. The other one are the people who are subject to the legislation that you have. And so when I look at this language, my first question is, if I find it confusing, and I dive into this stuff all the time, then while the clerks may say, or the Secretary of State may say, oh no, it's really clear, they're not the folks who are getting confused by this. And so when I see, for example, the concern about canceling a registration, what difference does it make when you cancel it? Because once it's canceled, you can't vote. So what difference does it make at what point, at what time do you cancel? The issue is when you go to re-register. So that putting that language back in about the cancellation, which then raises some issues about an individual who wants to cancel their registration because they have just moved to another state and they want to make sure that they are not registered in more than one jurisdiction. It captures them, and it captures it, I would say, needlessly, because again, it doesn't matter when you cancel, it matters when you re-register. The second piece has to do with the language of the statute and the realities of a database, a system that supports that. And so in the WildReg, the system that is used, which is the basis for determining if somebody is a qualified elector, that they've actually been entered in there, that they are active and all that. That data, by the way, persists. So if I unregistered, if I canceled, my voter ID would remain and everything in it would be locked at that point, with the exception of it would change from active to inactive. If I go back to register, they search for me, it's going to come up on their screen and they're going to see that I've got a voter ID and they're going to see that I am inactive. They also can see at what point did that occur. So, so putting back in or not pulling the language on cancellation I think unnecessary and doesn't serve this, and it's a point of confusion as well as this criticality about being registered in only one place. So again, I want to talk about the clarity for the electorate. So this decision tree I created that off of my understanding of what the proposed. I didn't see the Secretary of State's on there in advance. Is what is the process this goes through, and is this understandable to an individual of the electorate, a qualified individual who is either currently in the system, active or inactive, or brand new? So the first question is this the blackout period? So somebody comes into the office or stops by, whatever, and the first question is this the blackout period? If it's not the blackout period that was identified, then it doesn't matter. Give us the paperwork. We'll do what, we do our regular processes and we do whatever is needed in the system. If the answer is yes, it's in the blackout period, then is there a voter ID already in the system? In other words, at some point, either currently or in the past, they have been a qualified, and I keep saying that because the qualified is like kind of strange to me. If they're not in the system, then they are new and it's a new registration, and you go ahead and put it in the system and they're qualified to vote and they get a ballot. If it's yes, that it's in WyoReg, then the question is they have a piece of paper and they may have put in for a change of address and they fill out the whole thing, right? I don't believe that they just fill out one piece of it. Then the check is, okay, is the affiliation on this piece of paper different than what's in the system? And if the answer is no, then you go in the system, you make any of the changes that need to be made. It's an address, it's a whatever. If it's yes, it is different, then in the system, again, this is upon registration, is the last update in less than the previous year? In other words, is it outside of that time frame? And if it's no, then you do the re-registration. And re-registration is activating, making any changes and activating a record. If it was in less than that, then it goes to the update only fields other than affiliation. And my concern is that in our earnest attempt to close a loophole, that we cause confusion when I believe we're all in agreement that we don't want people to game that. We don't, if you want to change affiliation, decide before the blackout period. So if the only purpose of your putting in here is to get around it, then that takes care of it. And I agree that because of the way the legislation was passed, that's the result. My concern is that with the changes that I see from the Secretary of State, that it may take care of their understanding of the system and the process, and they can put rules, which the public never really reads, and maybe the clerks can. But what people can see is what's in the statute. And so I just request that you ensure that when you're all done with this, and I don't know that you're going to be able to get it today, given the last minute on the amendment, is that it is clear both for the people administering what the intent is, as well as the people who are subject to the changes. And I stand for questions.
So I think I understand what you said. Committee, any questions? Representative Ottman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Simmons, I know you look at this a lot, and while we have just received this, there has been work for a few months on this. So what I would like to hear is a response to what you had to say, because these are, while they're not the voters, we know it comes down into the election office, how we vote, when we can vote, and we can get those rules. So to dismiss what the Secretary of State's office and our county clerks are trying to do, I'm not sure that that's the way to go.
Is there a
But-
question in there?
Yeah, there
Yeah,
is.
yeah.
Yeah, can I hear?
Mr. Chair, I heard
rebuttal on
a
what she
question.
said? Yeah.
Okay.
So the first thing is I don't want to undo it and I don't want to challenge it. I think that it is an amendment that is well worth looking. I'd like to see it as usual, kind of woven in. I do have an issue with the cancellation. I just think that there is absolutely no need to restrict people from cancellation. For the rest of it, it's a matter of the language. So I'm not saying that we shouldn't do it. I'm saying that I have been looking through the proposed bill up until this morning and did not see this amendment until just now. So I'm saying that the public has not seen that proposed bill, and yet these bills have been worked through. So you may have seen this and other people may have seen it, but in a public process that impacts the public on a basic right, I'm simply saying that having more time than just an hour before you start discussing it is too short of a time frame in order to make sure that it accomplishes what the attempt is.
That's fair enough. Thank you. Follow up, anything? Good. Anybody else? So Ms. Simmons, while we're waiting for other people. So let me just try to paraphrase back what you said. You kind of like to reallow for cancellation as, I mean, the bill does, of course, but the secretary's proposed amendment would not allow for cancellation during that period. You think cancellation is important. And you think cancellation is important because, for example, people move and you know, they're practical reasons. What do you think about the reason that we should allow for cancellation because of the First Amendment to the Constitution? And that's that which guarantees the freedom of assembly. And the freedom of assembly, you know, I think you could argue that the freedom of assembly is the freedom to unassemble, meaning you can divorce yourself from, I've got lots of experience with divorces, I'll tell you that, but to divorce yourself from your political affiliation, so to speak, whether we restrict reassembling or not, that's going to be part of the bill, but you have that right as a First Amendment right to disassociate. Tell me what your thoughts would be on that.
Mr. Chair, I see it as equivalent to the idea of freedom of religion, which embedded in that is freedom from religion. And so I see it the same way. You're going to tell me that because sometime in the past I registered, that I can't cancel my registration? I absolutely believe that it's infringing upon First Amendment. And in this particular case, it's simply unnecessary. So it creates a condition that is not relevant to the true action that we want to make sure is two parts, that they canceled and they try to re-register. If all they do is cancel, no harm, no foul. Unless they're trying to register somewhere else and they have to attest that they're not registered. And so,
Clear.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Any questions? Any other questions? I think you're clear. Let's get the online testimony. Who do we have first? Mr. Black, are you with us? Glass.
Yes,
Oh,
Mr.
Glass.
Chairman, can you hear me?
Certainly can, loud and clear.
Uh,
Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Co-Chairman, and members of the committee. Thank you for allowing me to speak to you through Zoom today. Not only would it have cost me the entire day of work to travel to Douglas, but I have a bit of a cold. It's not COVID, fortunately, and I wouldn't want to spread it to anybody else. But in any event, I'm here to comment on 24 LSO 98, which addresses changes of party affiliation. Now, as you're doubtless aware, the Wyoming and U.S. constitutions, as Chairman just said, grant us a right to freedom of association, especially of political association. You and I have the right at any time to associate or not to with any person or group and to change our minds about that association at any time at all, not just at particular times of year. Just as you have a right to keep and bear arms, you have an absolute right to freedom of association. Our state and federal constitutions both guarantee you that freedom, the freedom not to be chained to a political party just because you once registered with it. This isn't a loophole. This is a right. Now, during the last legislative session, as you know, the Wyoming Senate narrowly passed HB 103, a bill that, in my opinion and that of many other citizens, unconstitutionally tries to take away this fundamental freedom. The only reason it hasn't been challenged yet in court, I believe, is that there hasn't been an election since that time, and so no one has had standing to sue. This bill, especially with the Secretary of State's proposed amendments, would make matters even worse by introducing additional complexity and ambiguity into the statutes, increasing costs and increasing the burden on our county clerks, as well as denying us that freedom. I mean, with this current draft, suppose you move away from Wyoming, register to vote in another state, and then have an opportunity to come back home to Wyoming within a year. Do you have the right to declare a party affiliation when you return at all? Under the original text, you don't. Does the clerk have to look up your prior Wyoming registration, checking every other county because you might not move back to the same county, and force you to re-register possibly against your will with a party that might be different from the one with which you registered in the other state? The language of this bill makes it unclear. And suppose a party which you normally don't support comes up with a truly superior candidate in the next election. Why can't you vote for that person to advance to the general election once you've been able to see the complete list of candidates, not when you don't know it yet? Mr. Chairman, as I understand it, it's a breach of decorum to name names, but 2 governors ago, Wyoming elected a governor who, in my opinion, was the better of the 2 candidates, even though he was of the minority party. And it was the right choice, I think. Now, that's the Wyoming way. We vote for the person rather than the party. And I think we need to go back to that rather than letting extremism and blind partisanship on the national level infect our state's election process. So I'd like to ask that you please amend this bill so that it simply restores our political freedom rather than adding confusion and complications to a statute that's probably unconstitutional to begin with. Not only would this be a return to our independent nature as Wyomingites, it would also conform to the U.S. and state constitutions that you've sworn in solemn oath to uphold. Anyway, that's all I have to say. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much, Mr. Glass. Any questions for Mr. Glass? Any questions? Thank you very much, Mr. Glass. I might have one question. I tend to agree with what you're still there, right? Okay, thank you. I tend to agree with what you say. Although I see a slight difference between the affiliating with a party and the party being able to decide whether they're going to let you in or not, versus unaffiliating. And it seems to me the right of unaffiliation stands higher, and you should be able to unaffiliate even though the party doesn't want you to, or the law doesn't want you to. Would you like to comment on that? You don't have to.
Mr. Chairman, I'll comment on that. Because the major political parties here in the United States basically have a duopoly, they don't have the right to refuse you the opportunity to register with them, and that's a good thing. This is if there's not case law here, but there's case law elsewhere. So as far as I can tell, you have the right to decide whether you associate with them. But they don't have the right to deny you your political freedom to register with them and pick a candidate.
Thank you very much, Mr. Glass. There is a court case I might point out to everybody. I believe is it Black versus California? I'll have to try to find that, but it actually upholds the restrictions that a party can have, but it does not deal with the unaffiliation issue. And it was a U.S. Supreme Court case. Anyway, so I appreciate Mr. Glass, and you're always a joy, and have a good day. Okay.
Thank you, Mr.
The next one is Mr. You're welcome. Is it, I hope I pronounced the name right. Is it Mr. Cope?
It's Cap, but that's all right.
Cap.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First off, I'm impressed with how this marathon you all are running here today. This morning was pretty brutal and y'all got through it. So thank you for the chance to speak here. The great thing is that Secretary Gray is there to speak and to provide his input. And frankly, I agree with everything he spoke about earlier. So number one, the reason I even took the time today to come here was the amendment as it's written and posted currently on the legislative website is pretty much untenable. It destroys the existing law, it takes out language that shouldn't be there, and it's pretty brutal. So I actually side with Secretary Gray on this one. First off, I would take his number one recommendation is that you allow him to do rulemaking. But if two, you do want to amend it, I would suggest looking at his amendments. And I'm going without even looking at his amendments. I trust the man so much that he probably provided some good feedback. So just wanted to provide you some comments from the peanut gallery out here that's why we're interested in this, and we're interested in not seeing that law change significantly, but obviously covering loopholes and errors that were left in it. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Cap. Any questions for Mr. Cap? Any questions for Mr. Cap? Looks like you got off easy. Where are you calling in from, Mr. Cap?
I'm out of Sundance, Wyoming.
All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Take care. All right. Is there anybody else wishes to testify? Anybody online? Anybody here? Yes, ma'am.
Good day, Mr. Chairman.
Hi.
Gigi Lehman from Commerce County. I'm in total agreement with the amendment or even the option that Secretary Gray has suggested here today. I do like the qualified elector language put in there. It's a defined term that's at the beginning of Title 22. It cleans it up, I believe, from a legal standpoint. And for those of us that understand that changing your affiliation is one thing, but you don't usually divorce someone and then remarry them within a couple months. You just don't do that. And so with
You'd be
that,
surprised at my background, but
I'm just saying that's not typical. That is an anomaly. If you have unreconcilable differences, it doesn't usually bode well to do that. I did have grandparents that did divorce and then remarried, totally different situation there, but it wasn't within a few months. So with that said, I can say it can happen, but not as often as to why this bill came into existence to begin with. And when something is allowing a wrong to happen where it's to gain the system, it is your job as legislators to represent the people to fix that wrong, because we shouldn't allow some wrong to happen just because they can get away with it. We want to shore it up to protect the people and protect the whole process of elections. And so I really 100% support Secretary Gray. And if he needs to do a policy piece with the law as it's written, I trust that'll be sufficient as well. Thank you.
thank you. Stick around. Any questions for the lady? Any questions? So I do have one. So I think that Ms. Simmons was raising a question about that doesn't hurt the heart of the crossover voting. I think you won't be able to change parties and vote in the other party. But she is advocating that we maintain the possibility of a person becoming unaffiliated. That means they won't vote in either primary. So they're not strategically working, but as a First Amendment right.
Sure.
And so I think some of us may be going down the route of trying to reconcile the goals that the crossover voting bill has achieved by being passed with the fact that you still ought to be able to unaffiliate somehow. So
Sure.
that's
Constitutionally.
yes. So that's kind of where we're at. And I appreciate any thoughts on that.
Yeah, so I agree with that. The issue really is where you have one party vacating their party to then garner the primary to then switch off because they wanted to actually participate in the other party for a while and then turn around and really go back to their party and then be able to have whatever whittles down. And so as long as that law is not being changed as to what you guys as a body did in the last session, it should be respected. And I believe Secretary of State Gray can actually achieve what he needs to with policy if needed. If someone will just, he should be just allowed to do his job too. So with
Well,
that,
thank you very much for your testimony. I'm a little bit having trouble with how that fits with allowing someone to unaffiliate. I confess.
Yeah,
We'll
well,
keep working on that.
yeah. All right.
I appreciate it. Anybody else? Anybody? Yes, sir. Come on up. Okay. Yes, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would just like to
You got to
remind,
reintroduce yourself. I'm so sorry.
I'm sorry,
It's okay.
Don Odom, State Director, Wyoming Restore Liberty.
Thank you.
I would just like to remind all the committee members, you're sitting there because the people in your districts chose you to be in the legislature. In the same way, the people of the state of Wyoming chose Secretary Gray. And we've seen a few attempts to undermine him since then, and that's in the past. But I trust Secretary Gray. I trust the people of Wyoming that put him in that chair. And I would just like for y'all to keep that in mind. I work a blue collar job for a living. I can't keep up with all this all the time. The only reason I'm able to be here is I'm recovering from surgery. But I trust our Secretary of State. And personally, I'm against just constantly adding new laws, new bills. We see it in DC. You don't even have any clue how many laws are governing our lives. And I would be content to allow his office to give the clerks guidance on this issue. But the clerks themselves have said they would like to see this passed along with his amendment. So as a citizen, I would second that they are the people that administer these types of laws. So I'm just sitting here saying that I support Secretary of State's or Secretary Gray's amendment on this bill, and I would encourage y'all to do so also.
Really appreciate your testimony. Any questions for the gentleman? Any questions? Thank you, sir. We might just take a little bit more time on this, though. We just saw the amendment. We did. And so if we slow it down a little bit, it's not going to be the end of the world to try to make this all fit. It's not undermining the secretary. Sometimes we just need a little bit more time because we're not quite so bright on the run. Appreciate
Understand.
it. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Okay. We have someone online. Ms. Davis, welcome. We can't hear you. I can see your lips moving. Hold on a sec. Are you muted on your end? There you go, Miss Davis.
There we go. Thank you, Chairman and committee members. Yeah, so I do come heavy-hearted that this is legislation that we've been working on. Many of you have been around long enough to know 10 years plus. We've been working on ending crossover voting. And it passed finally after many, many years. It passed through the House, it passed through the Senate, it was not vetoed by the governor. And here sits our law, once again being debated. The legislative office went through it. I don't think there was a need for any changes. And here it is, and then we're opening up change. So we fall in the same category again and again, like freedom, like you should be able to unaffiliate. Well, you can, all but a certain section of the time. You can vote, but not for the first 30 days you're there. You can hunt, but not till you're there for a year. We need to protect, once again, what the primary stands for. The primary is that us as a party can choose who represents us best. That is something only the party can decide. If you have the Hatfield and the McCoys is not going to choose who the Hatfields want to represent them. And so time and time again, we see where leaving this loophole open has failed us. The New York Times, New York knows. They wrote in February, after the 2022 election, that Liz Cheney, however you feel about her serving us or not, was counting on the leniency of our laws on the primary, where they allow crossover voting for Democrats and unaffiliated independents to enter the Republican Party to vote for who should represent them. And they go on to mention that that race was lost in the governor race from the first runner-up to the second by 9,000 votes. We have the Secretary of State posted for us, and the results where that's true. The loss was by 9,000 votes and over 10,000 people crossed over. And that's on your Secretary of State website. As a matter of fact, it tells who did what right here. And anyone can look on the Secretary of State website like I did. You know, 6,000 Democrats went to the Republican Party, 4,000 unaffiliated went into the Republican Party. There's more, but that's our number right then. So to say this isn't effective or it's stealing someone's freedom, the freedom that we've lost is us as a Republican being able to choose our own leadership for years. And it's true, you know, you look at it and those who control the elections control the state, control the country. We can look at that across the world. And so we're just asking for fair elections, for fair representation, and that this is being challenged again. I just have to say you is seriously disheartening. So I have a recording of what takes place. I would wonder if you've heard it and you know it, but I will play it. And I hope it's clear for everyone to hear, since it is an older recording, but I will hold it as close to the mic as I can.
How long is this going to take, Ms. Davis? Ms. Davis? How long will this take?
Oh, it's a few seconds, 35 or
Okay,
40.
go right ahead.
Yeah, sorry, I'm
Go
not
right
looking
ahead.
at a 2-minute thing here.
We're not hearing anything. We're honestly not hearing anything, ma'am.
Okay, I apologize. I don't know how to make it any louder, but it basically is a call that I received at my house that tells everybody that if you're Republican, independent, or whatever you are, it's the law. Go down to the primary, demand that they let you switch. It's your legal right, and vote for a moderate candidate. And they mention Mark Gordon, who's exactly the one who won by 9,000 votes when 10,000 people switched over. So it clearly is happening. It clearly has an effect. I mean, I like this man. He's passed since, wonderful guy in our town and of the Democrat Party. And he would go over and walk across the street, lived right across the street, and change to Republican and make his vote. But he also said, I have to change before I walk back across the street, because if a car hit me and I died, I wouldn't want to die a Republican. Now, is that who should be deciding who represents the Republicans? I don't think so. Like, this is a long-awaited law. Yeah.
Thanks a lot. We appreciate it. We surely do. Any questions for Ms. Davis? Any questions? Thank you very much. We appreciate your testimony. Anybody else? Last call. Secretary, great, back clean up.
Thank you.
Can I ask you, while you're thinking, is there a way to reconcile the restrictions of crossover voting with allowing someone to unaffiliate, guaranteeing they don't vote? We just protect that First Amendment right. Is there a way to do that?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd have to think more about it holistically, but right now my answer would be no, because you open up a loophole and then that loophole, all you have to do is cancel. And it's a tremendous loophole. It's actually identified. And I think the iteration from 2019 by Clerk Irvin.
Yeah, I remember that.
And so, in answer to your question, there might be a way to restrict somebody from changing canceling but not changing. I don't know if that gets, but you want them to be able to
No, no.
change their affiliation.
No, I just want them to be able to unaffiliate. So we could write the law to say, anybody can unaffiliate, they can get mad and walk out the door, but they still would not be permitted to vote in either party's election because they're unaffiliated. And that solves the problem of the crossover voting and gives people their First Amendment right to unaffiliate.
Right.
That's what I'm trying to put the two together. I am not trying to undo this thing. Everybody knows I disagree with it. Okay.
Yeah.
That's not what we're fighting today. I'm just trying to say, is there a way to allow people to unaffiliate, prevent them from voting in the election, following the guidelines and the timelines in the bill, but allow them that First Amendment right? Because I think, work with me and Mr. Rubino, maybe we could lose on that point on crossover, on a court challenge. And I'm trying to be helpful.
Yeah.
You go.
Mr. Chairman, I do think you conceptually do it without hitting at the heart of crossover. And I want to engage with you on that. As long as they can't affiliate.
That's
I
what
mean,
I'm
that that's where the problem is, right? And what we're trying to do by closing that loophole, I don't think we can do it right now. I think, you got one more meeting. If you want to, even then, integrating it into our system is not going to be easy. If you really want to do it for 2024, my other way of saying is we could do it in 25. But do you have a certain direction? Because if you're going to move this to the next meeting, I mean, is that the direction we're going?
Well,
okay.
we,
Because otherwise
the
I wanted to
committee
go
will
through the
decide.
amendment because I have heard a couple times that it just came to you. Well, we did send it yesterday and appreciate that feedback. But at the same time, we didn't have the bill until about 11 days ago. And I get that LSO is very busy, that the workload has changed a lot since I first got in there. And I don't think they were posted up to 8 or 9 days ago. So we were kind of working this out as soon as we saw it. And I
Fair
was
enough.
surprised. I thought it was just going to be 2 qualifieds before elector. And then we see this 10 days ago. And we say, whoa. And
we're
Yeah.
on the same page,
Right.
really.
Okay.
I'm not trying to undo crossover
Yeah.
voting, although all these fine people think so. But I'm wondering if we need more time to allow for the unaffiliation to be figured out.
Mr. Chairman, I think we do. And the other, we're waiting with kind of 2 pieces there. You got 2 different moving parts. If we are to if we were to table this bill until our next meeting, we would see the guidance from the secretary's office, which would tell us whether we need a bill at all.
That's fair
Honestly,
enough, too.
so I think we're burning a lot of time on something that we probably need to wait and see the guidance from the Secretary of State anyway.
Mr. Chairman, and I like that side of it. That's kind of where I'm. The unaffiliation, I mean, I will say, we're going to study this more. There are over 15 states that have closed primaries, and I don't think there's a constitutional concern. We're going to get the iteration of whether you can unaffiliate, this nuance, because I want to address, but I believe it stood. I really do. And I know
Fair
you
enough.
know some of the precedents, but
Hey, I think we're on the same page. Committee, if we kind of move it to the next meeting and sort out some of these things, prepare some formal amendments to go in both directions. Senator Scott.
Mr. Chairman, if you want to carry it to the next meeting, that's fine. I would defer to the chairman's wishes on that. I would think we ought to work it to the extent of adopting the Secretary of State's amendments at this time. So we'll have a clean draft for the next time.
I think that's fair, as long as it's still open, for sure. Any other thoughts? Representative Newsom.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I just have an ask of clarification and excuse my lack of knowledge on this base. I understand, and this might be for the Secretary of State's, for the clerks. We seem to have a pretty aggressive purging process for our voter rolls. And so I'm wondering if someone is purged from our voter rolls, if they decide to register again, are they tied to party, or are they free to affiliate with any party if they're officially purged from the voter rolls?
And Representative Newsom, I think we have to be careful because I think there's the voter roll and there's the voting list. or I'm sorry, the registration. So when they purge the list, a person doesn't become unregistered, right? I can
Okay.
use some head nodding,
No, they're inactive.
but
Yeah,
they're still a
It's
member of
my
the
under-
party.
No, I think it's my understanding that they are done and they have to re-register and go through the whole
Okay, we're
process.
getting head nods on that. You're right.
Re-register.
You are correct.
Mr. Chairman.
Go ahead.
Oh, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yes, I mean, we at some point maybe want to talk about the purge. I think we have a very aggressive purge statute, which is strong. It keeps clean voter rolls. If you don't vote in the general election, you are purged. When you're purged, you are an inactive, you're off the list.
Okay.
And so that would be, someone showed up on same day and they had been purged, they're not registered. It'd be a same day registration and they would be allowed to not only register, but affiliate. So that is a weakness in concert with the crossover bill. You know, I've thought a lot about how do you fix that, but I think that's a separate question. But yes, if you're purged, if you did not vote in the general election and you decided to register after the lockout date, more or less May 15th, you would be allowed to register and affiliate. That is a new registration. That gets to the qualified elector thing.
Fair enough. Thank you,
Thank you.
Representative Newsom, for your question.
Thank you. And so the question becomes, then that voter that has been purged from the rolls would then be allowed, if they voted in the primary, did not vote in the general, got purged, then in the next primary, they could show up and have whatever affiliation they wanted.
Mr. Secretary, if you want to take that.
Mr. Chairman, yes. And it's a weakness, but yes.
Anybody else? Thanks. Stay close. So committee, what's your pleasure? Senator Scott?
Mr. Chairman,
Need a motion on the bill
I'm
first.
going to give you a motion, but I want to make sure I'm getting it right for you.
Okay.
My understanding is you and the co-chairman would like to carry this over to the next meeting. So if I make a motion to do that, and then it would be open to amendments, and I'll move a version of the Secretary of State's amendment.
That's fair enough. Let's consider that as putting it on the table to be taken off soon. And so we could deal with your amendment. Does everybody agree with that procedure? Okay, they
So
agree. Go ahead. So
I'll
make your amendment.
I'll make the motion to carry this bill to the next time,
Okay,
and presuming I get a second for that.
okay.
And, Mr. Chairman, then I move the amendment presented to us by the Secretary of State with the addition that I tried on him on the last phrase in the amendment, after the word before, add the words or at. So it enables people to do it at the primary election, which I think is the intent.
Okay.
So, Mr. Chairman, I make that motion.
Is there a second? Well, I don't think we require seconds, or do we? I don't remember in this committee. I think we do in the full committee. The Senate committee does not. So we do have a second. We're good to go. Discussion. Representative Harrelson and then Senator Landon.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just one little thing on that last line, it would be at or instead of or at, I believe. Is that, or am I mistaken?
Or it's or at.
Or at before?
Before or at the
Okay.
next primary election.
Okay. Sorry. So it'd be after before instead of after affiliation then? So
Correct.
that would be, okay. Thank you. That was my
And,
my question.
and Mr. Chairman,
Go ahead, Senator Scott.
then there will be a following amendment to make an immediate effective date, because that's what the clerks like on election.
That's fair enough. Senator Landon, did you want to have something?
So, Mr. Chairman, thank you. And I think we're doing the right thing to forward the bill on. I just don't feel comfortable today, given, you know, a lot of the testimony was pretty much all over the place, to be honest. I'm a little reluctant on this amendment even, because I was told earlier in the day that the secretary would prefer not to do anything to the statute. And so we can work this in there, and then the bill becomes something entirely different from what was passed in the session. Lot of noise out there that this group shouldn't do anything with the law that was passed. And so I'm trying to just try to digest all of that, Mr. Chairman, and I wonder if we don't want to give it enough time and just take this back up in the third meeting. And bring this at that time. It's new enough. I don't think the public's even seen this really, so.
Okay, so there are two ways to handle this parliamentary. You could argue that we should vote no on Scott's amendment. Or you could suggest that we just table the bill till the next meeting, which would be a precedential motion and we'd have to vote it. So I'm just throwing that out to get us forward. Would you agree, Senator Scott?
Mr. Chairman, for the amendment, I think we're better off putting the Secretary of State's amendment, which I think is well done, into the bill, because that will then give the public notice of what we're actually working from. And I think that's better. I think if you just table it to next time, we'll have the same confusion next time with the public not knowing what's in the bill. And I think the Secretary of State has genuinely improved the bill.
Okay, anybody else want to weigh in? You can throw the bomb about the tabling if you want. Representative Knapp.
I'm going to be in favor of that amendment. And I think when we get to the next meeting, I think that choice will be clear of doing nothing and allowing that to be done by the Secretary of State, or to go with this particular bill, after people have time to read it and understand it. But I think at that point, adding any unaffiliation will further complicate it and probably should be brought either in a separate bill or at another time. But because it truly changes the legislation currently in place, the statute currently in place. So hopefully we see that choice next meeting of doing nothing or this bill with the amendments.
Thank you, Representative Knapp. Anybody else? Representative Yen.
Mr. Chairman, just to throw a fourth option there, I'm fine with doing nothing at all and not using the time in the next meeting. Because I frankly would rather see what a challenge would look like. So I think I might be with all the people who provide public comment to say, let's do nothing to the bill.
Thank you, Representative Yen. Anybody else? Senator Landon.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, not to belabor, but I just wanted to follow up. I'm not going to suggest any amendment. I think the will of the committee seems to be that we want to adopt the amendment. I'll probably be a no on this. I'm just not comfortable doing anything with the bill, given the fact that we just received the amendment not too long ago. So thank you, Mr. Chairman.
You're welcome. Thank you, Senator Landon. Any other discussion on Scott's amendment? Representative Wiley.
Mr. Chairman, just some clarification. Are we going to have the amendment to adopt this with the caveat of going to effective immediately? I don't think we
Yes,
ever-
the effective immediately was included.
Mr. Chairman, no, it wasn't, but I will move that if this amendment passes.
You want to just make it friendly? I don't think anybody's opposed.
Okay. Okay, if Chairman would prefer that, let's do it.
Save some time. Anybody else? Everybody got it? Ready for the question? All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
All opposed? Heard a couple of grumbles. The bill's still here. Does anybody want to offer anything about trying to allow people to unaffiliate and closing any loophole for them reaffiliating to game anything, but to actually allow for their First Amendment right? Does anybody want to offer anything in the area? Okay, well, someone could bring it privately at the next meeting. All those in favor of the original motion, which is to carry this over to the next meeting? Wait, is there anything else? Hearing nothing, all in favor of the original motion to carry it over to the next meeting, signify by saying aye. Opposed, no. I'm a little confused. All those in favor, raise your hand, please. Got 1, 2, 3, quite a few down here. That whole row. Looks like the ayes have it, no matter how loud the no's are. So that's our plan. We'll carry this bill over to the next meeting. It'll be rewritten with the good secretary's proposed amendment and the effective immediately date, and we'll take it up again. Okay. The next one is 24 LSO 99 campaign reporting. Who's got it? Josh does.
Mr. Chairman, Josh Anderson, LSO. This is 24 LSO 99. Again, this also came out of our last meeting in May, at the end of the meeting, with this discussion of certain groups that make campaign expenditures, but that might not be able to file or and register with the Secretary of State for purposes of campaign reporting. So what this bill does is expands what the definition of organization is for the purpose of that statute. You can see the existing definition at the top of page 2. It's fairly broad, but is limited to different types of group corporations, partnerships, unions, other groups that are profit or nonprofit entities. What this would do is add an additional type of organization that would need to register, which would be any group of 2 or more persons that do not otherwise meet the definition of organization, that pool or otherwise jointly expend funds totaling more than $1,000. Again, that's the same amount that applies to all of those other organizations. Even if the expenditure of those pooled funds is made by one individual. And provided that the group is not required to file as an organization if subparagraph A on line 18, all members of the group are disclosed in the electioneering communication, or subparagraph B, all members of the group are relatives. That second exception was primarily added to this to prevent spouses from being affected by this. You can see that the definition of relative is much broader than that, and certainly a policy choice there for you as a committee. And that's the bill, Mr. Chairman. I'd take any questions.
Questions for Mr. Anderson? Senator Scott?
Mr. Chairman, bottom of page 2, item number B there. As I read that as it is written, if they're relatives, they don't even have to disclose what family they're in. I don't think that's the intention. Mr. Chairman, is that correct? And if that is, I think the way to fix it, Mr. Chairman, is to simply eliminate B and just go with A. And so if a family does, they can do it, but they got to list their members that are doing it.
Mr. Anderson?
Sure, Mr. Chairman. Yeah, I think why I added that is so if I make an expenditure with pooled funds with my spouse, that we wouldn't have to register as an organization, even though it's an expenditure under my name because I've pooled funds with my spouse. Again, like I said, a policy question there could certainly be eliminated, but I was trying to avoid that issue of making a small family unit register as an organization.
Mr. Chairman.
Senator Scott?
Mr. Chairman, what I'm thinking is the actual language you've given us here has exempted, if you're a family group, you don't even have to say which family. And I don't think that's consistent with the intent of the bill.
And again, Mr.
Mr.
Chairman,
Anderson?
just to clarify, so I think the point was if I make an expenditure, I identify myself, but I haven't identified other members of my family, but we've pooled funds together. Should that family unit need to register as an organization with the Secretary of State? If I've identified myself personally with my expenditure that I've made. So I think that was what we were trying to address with that, Mr. Chairman.
So Mr. Anderson, just sort of seems like there's this notion that a husband and wife or an immediate small family ought to be able to qualify under the individual exemption, basically. But once it gets a little farther than that, this language with all these relatives, I think these are the people that would show up if I won the lottery. And then some of these people I have never even seen, that's quite a long list. Could we just say immediate family? And is there any definition of that?
Mr. Chairman, it certainly is a broad definition of what relative is, and you could certainly narrow that down.
Anybody else for Mr. Anderson? Mr. Co-Chairman.
Just curious on the co-chairman's question. Is there in the election code an immediate family definition that you know of?
Not that I'm aware of, Mr. Chairman, and this definition of relative was from statute, but not from the election code. But can certainly look and see if there's something that's
This
more
probably came from
narrow.
like the probate code or.
It looks that way.
And there certainly we could find one that's more narrow than that, Mr. Chairman.
What is the meaning of immediate family? Does anybody have a thought what that is? Mr. Anderson, do you have any thought what immediate family means?
Whatever we define it.
Yeah, good question.
Yeah,
Mr.
well, it
Chairman.
might be used elsewhere.
Yeah, I'm not aware. I have to do a little digging. I can look real quick when I get back to my computer and see if I find anything good.
Like a
Mr.
parent
Chairman.
and children, is that?
Mr. Chairman, in Title 22, we do have a definition of immediate family.
Let's hear it.
It is a spouse, parent, sibling, child, or other person living in the individual's household.
Works for me.
So even a roommate.
Okay, Mr. Anderson, thanks a lot. Good job. Would anybody like to address this? Anybody, Ms. Freeze?
Mr. Chairman, Julie Freeze, Fremont County Clerk, and speaking only for Fremont County. So this was one of the issues that I brought up in Lander. So I'm glad to see that we're proceeding in some direction. But I guess when does the money get big enough that it matters to you? So if you get $10,000 and it's my immediate family, how do you know that? That's what was my point last time. How do you know where the money's coming from? Unless you just say it, like in my campaign finance, my kids gave me money, I put it down. I mean, why is that a bad thing?
You mean the disclosure?
The disclosure. I mean, otherwise you don't know. I'm just saying, well, it's all and I experienced that in my job last time, is that there were things going out in the news media that were not clear. And I want to know, don't you want to know? Don't you want to know who's spending money? Is it dark money? Is it corporations? Is it something that's not supposed to be? And so what difference does it make on the family side of things? That was kind of a new piece. So that's just for you to think about.
Okay.
On the organization of a new category, which is fine. Curious, because it was a problem for this one committee who should have been a PAC at the time. They couldn't file with the Secretary of State because it doesn't allow it on the electronic system, which still just drives me batty that you can't work beyond that. But is this something similar? Do I have to have a chairman and a treasurer? And am I going to be able to do that? In the county, we can do it because it's all by hand pretty much. But I mean, I don't see anything as like what the criterias are. So I don't know. I'm just wondering what the category of this actually is.
Anybody on the committee? Ms. Freeze, I'll take a chance at this.
Okay.
I think we're trying to get at the disclosure. And disclosure was a problem in that previous instance because they didn't have those officers. So they said they didn't have to disclose. Well, it's not the officers that are important, it's the disclosure that's important. So if this doesn't require officers from this organization, I tend to, speaking personally, think that that's better.
And Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, again, because we work with people, I understand that people get excited about a campaign. So now they think, I have a little bit of money, I'm going to go help. But nobody thinks about all the rules. So it needs to be something so that people understand that there is a way to do it. And even if I didn't do it ahead of, and now it's brought to my attention, it's easy enough to fix. Does that make sense?
Fair enough.
Because that was one of the things I said is just file. I mean, just my attorney wasn't agreeing with me, but I'm like, just file. I feel like you are a PAC and here's all the criteria and here's what you told me. Just file. And they didn't have to because my county attorney said they didn't have to. But just want to make it so that they can file, because a lot of times those are little, but, and then I'm just throwing it out to you, but what happens when it becomes big? That's just the whole thing is, do you want to know the disclosure of where people are spending money?
Senator Landon.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. Ms. Freeze, thank you, because I was sitting here thinking I've got to be the only one who's having a little bit of misgivings about this bill. And in your experience, have candidates disclosed what family members have given them? How about just a wag of some kind, just based on your experience? Do you think people are reporting that? Because if not, I just don't think this bill is going to do what we want it to.
Ms. Freeze.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Landon, I believe that some of them have done that. And the one thing about it is if you, and your expenditures don't have to match. I mean, it seems weird if you have more expenditures. I've seen this where more expenditures and you don't show the money. Where did that come from? Usually it's yourself. It's just a mistake that way, but I believe people might do that. I mean, we're county, so we're not that big of expenditures. You might look at that at the state level and see. My whole point that I meant last time is that if we don't do something, I had given you the example that I could say, the next time I run for office, my husband Bert will just go out and get with all his buddies and wherever he wants to find money and say, I am doing it under my First Amendment right.
Which
campaign-
candidate would he support?
Me, of course. So I'll tell him to. But I mean, so he could do that and then you would never know. That was the whole point of this, is that do we want to have a loophole where that can happen? And again, this was a smaller thing, but what happens when it becomes big and we just say it's a First Amendment right? Because we have a hole in there. We're talking about holes that we're trying to fill up. That's just one of the holes I'd like to see filled up. So.
You make a good point. Senator Landon.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. Ms. Priest, thank you for that. I would say that if you stay in office long enough, your spouse is liable to put a group together to campaign against you.
Absolutely. Absolutely, he would.
Anybody else? Senator Scott, your light's on, but I don't think you're ready.
Thank you. So just some questions. Thank you for the opportunity.
No, I think they're great questions. And that gets back to Senator Scott. I suggested just getting rid of B entirely. And that might be a good way to go. And if we did that, we might hear about at our next meeting about why we need to have that in. So, but anybody else wish to testify on this bill? Anybody else in the audience? Ms. Simmons. You do a lot of homework on these bills, I'll tell you that. Welcome.
I'm retired. Gail Simmons, Civics 307. I found this bill, like I couldn't figure out what it was trying to do. Having heard Clerk Freeze, if I've got this right, we've got PACs and on the state, it's electronic. I've had to deal with the electronic ones. It's not user friendly. And then you have to you have to have the officers. On a county PAC, it's actually pretty easy. As long as you are aware that you need to create a PAC, you won't go there. But I think the important thing, if I'm getting this, it's about having disclosures and having, regardless of who or where or how or why, if money is gathered and expended in electioneering or independent, is having that be available. What has it been spent on and who's been giving the money? And when I look at it that way, I'm not getting how this does this because it doesn't have, I don't see a mechanism for it. And I agree that it needs to be. I also would recommend getting rid of B. I took a very prominent family in the state and did a query off of the voter registration data I have on that last name, and there were 54 people. So I think that there is something that needs to be addressed here. And when I read this, I don't see how it's doing that. So I think maybe go back to the drawing board and say, this is what we're intending to do. Maybe it's if it meets this criteria, they only have to file in their county, even if they've given money for somebody who otherwise would be in the state, because they don't have the criteria to get into the state system. So that it's reported and the expenditures there and the contributions are there and it's reported, which I think is the really critical issue that Clerk Freeze was saying, and I agree with. And so maybe providing that provision. So the transparency is there. I'm not sure this does that, or that it creates a vehicle that could even be done. And I stand for questions.
Questions for Ms. Simmons? Any questions for Ms. Simmons? Ms. Simmons, hang in there for a second. What good does it do on a legislative race to have a filing at the county that you can't compare against the others, or or have I think if we're going to have filing, it has to be, and it's for any race, they all have to be at the same place. And I think the fact that you don't necessarily need a treasurer and a thing to make expenditures. You might legally, but you don't, and people don't all the time. We're going to sit down and work this out, and we're going to buy some radio ads. Let's put our money in a pot. You don't have to have a treasurer. You just do it. It's the disclosure that's important, and you made that point. But
so, Mr. Chairman,
yes,
in order to create if this organization meets the criteria of being a PAC, in order to create a PAC on the Secretary of State's site so that you can do that disclosure, you must have a chair and a treasurer to register it at all. And that's the point that I'm making, is that
that's the point I'm making.
Yeah,
But I think we're coming at it from two different directions.
could be. But my point is, I pull contribution money all the time. I get all kinds of good information about that when I'm pulling this data. So I'm in agreement with that. I'm saying that the way this is written right now doesn't provide the mechanism to do what we're asking or what we would like to have be done, which is to collect that information and make it available publicly. And I don't think this bill, as it's currently drafted up, provides for that provision. I think that provision needs to occur, and I don't think this does it. Mr. Chair.
Chairman, please.
Chairman, sorry. Mr. Chairman, one thing that could be required to make that distinction, because PACs can be set up at the state level and at the county level. And the state level is only required for state level. I mean, you can put some others in there, but it's only mandatory for candidates, I believe, at the state level, is basically require them to have a PAC, and then require that the system be changed to allow for those that have a formal organization and those that have an informal organization. This could actually be solved, not immediately, but solved by expending some funds for in the Secretary of State's office to allow to set up a PAC that doesn't have that structure, but then gives the means to do all the reporting. And frankly, you could do that whether it's within a county or within a district.
Any other questions for Ms. Simmons? Ms. Simmons, I disagree with you in the sense that people are just going to do the action. They're going to have the rally. They're going to pool their funds. They're going to do it. It's going to be done. They're not going to run and form a PAC first, or they're not even going to think about forming a PAC. And the point in this situation, they never formed a PAC, but they did spend funds against Wyoming law. And so that's what we have to do, is require the reporting. And people need to know that when they do this, they come under Wyoming law. The PAC issue, starting at the top down, saying, if you do that, you must form a PAC. That's what the law already says. So
Mr. Chairman, I was simply looking for a way that we could do this because I think that I hope everybody's in agreement. The disclosure needs to happen. I don't see that a vehicle exists that allows for that to be done unless they create a PAC. I don't think they should have to create a PAC, but I do think they should have to report.
anybody else? Thanks. Anybody else want to testify? Anybody online? Committee, I suspect this one needs some more work too. Is there anything here we want to carry forward? Do you want to keep considering it? Tell me what your pleasure is. Senator Scott.
Mr. Chairman, I do think it needs to go forward because I do think there's an issue on the reporting of it. I do think we need to eliminate item B because with the extensive families you can have, item B becomes impossible to discern what's really going on. We could tighten it up to immediate family, or we could just remove B and say, you got to list the members that are actually paying for it. Mr. Chairman, a question to the chairman. You want to do that at this point before we carry it forward, or how do you want to handle it?
I think the best and cleanest way would be to get a motion on the bill, deal with that amendment, and then carry it forward to the next meeting and seek other solutions, including from Ms. Simmons, on this bill. So
Yeah, move the bill.
motion on the bill. I think I heard my co-chairman move it. Who's seconding it? Scott second.
Mr. Chairman,
Go ahead.
move we delete from the bill, item B, starting page 2, line 22, carrying it over, through, page, 4, line 4. And same time, Mr. Chairman, move we change the effective date to immediate as per the county clerk's previous request in the other bills.
Okay. Discussion on this motion? Any discussion? All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Back on the bill, is there any other directions we'd like to give for the bill? And this is not a roll call vote. We're just moving to carry it on to the next meeting. It'll be a voice vote. Any other direction? How about along the lines of what Ms. Simmons, I'd encourage you to maybe come up with more suggestions. You want to do that? Other people that might be interested in this, please do so. It's pretty open right now. Secretary of State might take a look at it in terms of this. This is catching the people that do the PAC stuff without creating a PAC, basically. So appreciate your input on that. So the Senator Scott.
Mr. Chairman, I'm going to urge us that at the next meeting, we do not require a centralized filing of these things. Because I think that people, small groups of people, they're going to be meeting around the kitchen table or meeting as a part of their normal breakfast club or something. And you'll get informal groupings that just do it. And I think if you require reporting, they'll simply ignore you and get in trouble. And I think we'll chill that kind of political behavior. And I think as long as the disclosure is there on the material, we're fine.
Okay.
But that's just a suggestion for people to think about for the next time.
That's fair enough, Senator Scott. Anybody else? Anything else on this bill? So the motion is just to carry it over to the next meeting. It's just to keep working on a bill draft. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Any opposed? It's carried over to the next meeting. We are, I think we're at 10 a.m. and not really. We've actually done pretty well. We have special districts now, and so we have a bill draft and we have Mr. Pepper. And so Mr. Secretary, would you start us off on the whole issue of special districts? Is that okay? Thank you.
Well, I appreciate it, Mr. Chairman. Our main topic was 24 LSO 100. Do you want it to be introduced by the LSO first, or do you just want us to roll into our comments on our bill draft?
What's your pleasure? Josh, you got time to come up here and sit with the secretary and tell us about it? Let's just do that. Thank you, Mr.
Okay,
Secretary.
thanks.
Mr. Chairman, Josh Anderson, LSO. This is 24 LSO 100. Again, this was another issue that was brought by the Secretary of State's office at the last meeting on trying to clarify when the governing body of members of a governing body of a special district are appointed to fill a vacancy, when that appointment terminates. On page 2 there, you can see that the existing language indicated that they shall serve until the next regular election. There was some concern about whether that was being allowed to extend that term of office beyond that time. So this language would say until expiration of the term of office that the appointee was appointed to fill, and that term of office shall not be extended in any manner beyond that term of office. That's the bill as drafted, Mr. Chairman. I'd take any questions.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Anderson. Any questions for Mr. Anderson? Any questions for Mr. Anderson? Seeing none, Mr. Secretary. Thank you for
Thank you.
keeping us on track.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate it. Again, for the record, my name is Chuck Gray, the Wyoming Secretary of State, and to our left, we have Joe Rubino, our Policy Director and Counsel. Again, I wanted to thank you for taking up the topic of special district vacancies that we had brought in May. As I testified in May, our office has received several comments and suggestions that current Wyoming statute allows, or at least does not prohibit, special districts from unilaterally extending the terms of appointment. The intent of our original proposal was to ensure that special districts would be prevented from doing so. We followed up a little more with the county attorney, which was the most from the county, or the most prominent example of where an extension occurred. And while I think the intent, we learned more about the intent, they were trying to align their elections. We still believe that this should be shored up, and there should not be an extension of the 4-year term. It's just not, or whatever that term of office is, it's just not appropriate. And after speaking with special districts, county clerks, and county attorneys, we still do again feel the intent of the proposed LSO draft is necessary to ensure that appointees' terms cannot be unilaterally extended. However, we do believe some small clarifications would ensure that both the intent is effectuated without compromising the meaning behind the original statute. While it is important to prevent appointees from having their terms extended, the intent should also be to promote the use of elections to fill spots on special districts where possible. Therefore, we have a proposed amendment with slight changes to the LSO language. Do you guys have that one? Do you folks have that one? It's a proposed amendment to LSO 100.
That one?
Great. This amendment, I think it's pretty simple. This amendment ensures that appointees' terms are not extended, and that any appointee to a special district will serve until the next subsequent director election, rather than the current draft language, which specifies serving until the end of the term. This is done by adding language that ensures that an appointee's term will only go until a successor for the remainder of the unexpired term is elected at the next director election. The main change here is that the original language as drafted promotes appointees' terms from being extended, while ensuring that special districts may fill the remainder of terms with elections if possible. This outcome ensures that more directors are selected through the election cycle rather than by appointment where possible, while also ensuring the original intent of the legislation. So again, to reiterate, what the amendment does is it just says that the next time there's a director election, when there's an appointment, they would fill the remainder of that term at that election, which is sort of a policy question. But the overall intent, which is to prevent a term from being extended, is there regardless. This amendment gets to this question of whether it comes up for election the next time, or whether you allow them to fill their whole term.
Got it. I think I got it. Senator Scott.
Mr. Chairman, the question I've got, and I may just not understand the amendment, having just seen it. But suppose you have a circumstance where you've got a director election coming up and a week before the election, a director dies, resigns suddenly, unexpectedly, and you simply don't have time to get a replacement on the election. Is that a possibility if we adopt this amendment?
Secretary Gray.
Mr. Chairman, I think with that scenario, we'd be fine. For one, I think it would be unlikely that they'd fill the vacancy right before the election. If they did, that election had already been put out for election. I don't think then it would be up. It's like some of the iterations when there's a vacancy in statute. If it occurs after a certain period, it is not up at that next election. Now, should we add that sentence in there? We could work on that language. I'm not sure it would key into other catch-alls in the statute where if it's after a certain period close enough to the election, it doesn't apply. But I understand your scenario. Turn to council here. Do you have any opinion on that?
And
Mr. Chairman.
does this deal with the situation of staggered terms? Or is that not part of this? Just help me on that too.
Well, this would make it to where it would only go until the next election, right? So originally proposed and drafted, it was the fulfillment of that term, that complete term. So if you had a 4-year term, then it would go through that next election potentially and go to another election. Now we have it to where there's two parts of it. You can't extend it. That was sort of the original intent. But then instead of the appointee going until the remainder of that term, you would go until the next general election, which mirrors other statutes for filling vacancies. If I could get a little bit to Senator Scott's question, I think, and I want to make sure that I understand it correctly, what you're saying is through some event after an appointment, before an appointment?
Mr. Chairman.
Senator Scott, back to you.
Mr. Chairman, I'm concerned.
Get close to that microphone.
Mr. Chairman, I'm concerned, and maybe I'm reading things that aren't there. That's why I'm asking, but I'm concerned. Suppose you have, I think your language works fine if the vacancy occurs at a reasonable time before the next director election. But suppose you have an unexpected vacancy just before a director election. Are they compelled to elect even though they haven't had the time to do so?
Mr. Chairman, if I may, I think the scenario that he's laying out, let's say the election is August 15th. If July 1st, a director passes, they fill the vacancy, but they don't have time to have it for the August 15th election go up because that is the next election. How would that be handled? As opposed to the example he gave the first time, which was what would happen if it was 7 days before it? My answer was, well, they probably wouldn't have time to fill the appointment. But I think the that's one way to look at it.
Gotcha.
And I'm trying to understand it too. And help me, I think it'll help everybody. So this person's name would be on the ballot, or he or she would have been standing for the election, but they're not. Because they're dead, they're not available to.
And
So
Mr. Chairman, at that point, I believe that it would be similar to what we have now. A vacancy would exist.
Right.
And so at that point, you're right after the election, someone who was on the ballot cannot take office by virtue of being deceased under that scenario, because nobody would have time to get ready to run an election or do anything like that under that scenario. Under another scenario, and you had someone scramble and they did it in time, then the next general election would take care of that because the vacancy would persist until that election, and then the election would take over.
And you could possibly also have a write-in.
But if you don't have that, then you trigger a vacancy.
Senator Scott.
Mr. Chairman, my question's a little different. Suppose you had 4-year terms on directors. I don't know. I think you do in some of the special districts. And you have an election every 2 years. And somebody in the middle of their term ceases to be a director just before a director's election. can you appoint them to just fill out the rest of the term, or are you compelled to have an election under this language? Even though you don't really have time to organize it properly.
I believe under a strict reading of the language, you would have an election and there'd be no one on there.
So Scott,
And then you could get a write-in or something
Exactly.
that could give you a perverse result because you hadn't really had time to organize an election formally. I think, Mr. Chairman, there's a need for a time period in, 60 days or 90 days or something like that.
Mr. Secretary.
Mr. Chairman, my memory's being jogged here. This did come up with our conversation with the Cook County attorney. I think if you had somebody pass or resign when the election's already been called and you either have nobody running, which happens sometimes, or the person who presumably was on the ballot, if it's only that incumbent, is no longer alive or is resigned, then you have another vacancy and then it's up at the next election. So I don't know if you have to have that, but I'm fine for clarity's sake if you want to have us draft something up or you have some idea on some language. We could also do it in the session if you want to move forward with the bill draft today.
We've got another meeting, but
Right.
I have a feeling the clerks want to weigh in.
Okay.
Oh, I thought you would, when you get that posture.
Well, Mr. Chairman, for the record, and I never want to speak for them, I do think there's some disagreement with the clerks about
Okay.
whether to have it come up at the next regular election or, allow them to fill out the remainder of the
Gotcha.
term. So.
Okay. Any other questions? Representative Newsom.
Thank you. I want to circle back to our good chairman's question about the staggering of terms. So as we know, in a lot of special districts, when they're initially created, terms are staggered. So there's a revolving term. So the whole board doesn't leave at once or stand for election at once. So in this scenario, if someone resigned and then there's an appointment, and then there's an election, would that election be for the shorter period of time that would constitute the remainder of the term? Or would it be for a full term? So if somebody's 2 years into a 4-year term, somebody resigns, somebody's appointed, then would they stand election for a 2-year term, which would be the completion of the original term? Or would they stand for a 4-year term, throwing off kind of that staggering of terms that was initially contemplated in the formation of the district?
Thank
Mr.
you,
Chairman.
Representative. Secretary Gray.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It would be the first. The staggering would remain in place. It would be the remainder of the existing term, which would be 2 years in your iteration. So the staggering would remain in place. And that's one of the things about some of these cases of terms being extended. I mean, it could mess with the staggering. And so that's one of the reasons I think to have this in statute.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Anybody else? Anybody else in the committee? Let's hear from the public. Thanks. Stay close. Anybody in the room wish to testify? I knew she was going to testify. I can tell this stuff. Ms. Freese, welcome.
Mr. Chairman, committee, and this just to back up what the secretary said. So just kind of give you a better feel for that. So originally, yes, when a special district happens, they put everybody on the ballot and then they stagger those terms, or they get to choose them after they're elected. But once you're into a full district, then they are staggered just like any other terms are, the 4-year terms. So what this does, which we talked to them after Lander, because originally it said that you could extend clear to the end of that term. And so the scenario I gave to them was, what if I was just elected 2 months ago for a 4-year term and now I decide to quit or I die or whatever? Do you really want to appoint? Does the public really want us to appoint somebody to fill a complete term, or do you want to
3.5
get somebody to
years.
try for election? I've had people say that. Wow, I can't wait to get on the election. I'll never get appointed by this board, but I might get elected by my peers. So just so you know. So, and if you've seen on your ballot an unexpired 2-year term, that is what that means, is that there's a certain point in time, and what we as clerks have generally looked at is when the filing period ends, then if you have somebody die or quit or for some reason is, whether they're on the ballot or not, it does not matter. So if I have anybody, we kind of look at when the filing period ends, then then you just appoint and then they finish to the end of the term, if that will help. And that's just been, because you have to come to that criteria of when do you stop. So I don't know if I can answer any other questions. That's all I was trying to do, is just kind of help what happens in our world. So.
We appreciate that. Are there any questions for Ms. Freeze? Thank you very much, Mr. Pepper.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mark Pepper. I'm the Executive Director of the Wyoming Association of Rural Water Systems. I have about 150 special districts that are members of our association, water and sewer or improvement and service joint power boards. I was confused by this because current statute pretty well leaves the staggering and everything in effect, that if there's an midterm vacancy, you appoint somebody to fill out the rest of the term, and then they stand for election. I was one of those in a special district. I filled out a 2-year, I think I served for 2 years and then stood for election. I don't see that as very confusing. I don't know in my world with the associations or the districts that we work with, I don't see a whole lot of people saying, well, since nobody decided to run for election, we'll just reappoint you. We always encourage whoever was to run for election. So I don't know that it's necessary for the clarification. I like the idea of forcing somebody to run for an unexpired term, as long as nobody gets confused and forgets that it was only a 2-year term or a 1-year term or whatever the case may be. I think the system works now where you just have people who are appointed and they serve to the next election. And if they want to stand for election, they run. If they don't, we hope that others step forward and fill the term or fill an election. So I'm not totally opposed. I'm just, I hadn't seen it until just now. I've been traveling, so I apologize for that. So I'm a little confused.
And
No.
Mr. Pepper, I think the thing that this was trying to fit is people that somehow remain appointed on an ongoing basis past the term of their original appointment. And I think that's what the secretary's issue. I don't mean to speak for you, but I'm getting ahead on.
I can see that's a possibility. I don't see it in my day-to-day work very much. And we train probably 60% of the boards in the state on governance issues. And that's one that we pretty well pound on. Our board training was just approved by the Department of Audit to fulfill that minimal fiscal training requirement. But we've been doing it for decades. I just don't see it happening that often. I could see, not in my realm, in the water and sewer area, I don't see it. There may be other special districts that have that issue. I would put that back on some of the things that you all have done in the past in requiring a lot of that information be placed on the F-32s. And some of the board, how often do you have board meetings, posting your board meetings, filing all of that with the county clerks, filing the budgets with the county commissioners and ahead of time, which includes elections, the whole routine. So I'm not so sure that what you've done in the past hasn't addressed some of that issue, at least in my world. I can't speak for all 800 special districts that are out there, but I can speak for the 250 plus water and sewer special districts.
And just for the record, that form that you're talking about is the form that goes to Department of Audit?
Correct. F-32 or the F-66, depending on where you're at.
Gotcha. Any questions for Mr. Pepper? Any questions for Mr. Pepper? Thank you, Mr. Pepper. Do we have anybody else in the audience who'd like to testify? Yes, sir. Come on up.
Mr. Chairman, body, I'm Don Larson, Converse County. I'm a member of the Senior Citizen Special District. And it was made expressly clear to me in the handbook and the bylaws when I was elected as a write-in candidate on how this process works, at least for our board, in that if a person is appointed, they stay in that job until it's terminated as to its extension. If it's a 2-year appointment, a 3-year, 4-year, whatever it is, that when that expires, then you either run in an election or you bail out. And like I say, it was made extremely clear to me when I was elected last November. So that's what I have to say.
Thank you, Mr. Larson. Any questions for Mr. Larson? Thanks for that. We appreciate it. Anybody online? Secretary Gray. You're the Secretary of State.
You.
You really like those second
Chairman.
bites.
Yeah, I do. I do. Well, Mr. Chairman, I appreciate it. I just want to respond to a commenter before last and just lay out, there are two issues here. One is not having terms be extended, and that is the intent of the bill. And there have been some cases. There was one that specifically that came to our attention. The intent was not bad, but they did extend out a term beyond the 4 years, and their feeling was the statute didn't prohibit it. And right now, I don't think it does either. And so that was the interpretation from our counsel and our office. And then you have the second issue, which I think gets to Mr. Pepper's points, which is when is the vacancy going to be filled when there's an appointment? When is it going to be up for election? Okay. And all this amendment does is bring it back basically to what is the status quo, I think. I mean, we phrase it a little bit different, I believe, to make it clear, but you could just put back the stricken language the next regular election, and I think it means the same thing. And that's my interpretation of it. And so, I think Mr. Pepper was mainly getting at that point. I think with the amendment, it goes back to the way it is. Now, again, this overall thrust is preventing an extension of a term, and all we're trying to do with the amendment is take it back to where we are currently. And if you wanted to put back that stricken language, I think that'd be okay too.
Great. Hang in there. Questions for Mr. Secretary? Senator Land.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. So, Mr. Secretary, I apologize if I'm riding a slower horse here. If it just seems to me as though sometimes it's really hard to find these board members of these special districts. And let's say right now, I get appointed to a special district and it's a 2-year term. Maybe it's a 3-year term. It'll carry forward to the election after this next one. On the one hand, I get it because we have to stand for election when we're appointed in the legislature. But I wonder, was it legal counsel that led you to think that maybe it's better for us to make those appointments stand at the very next election cycle? Sometimes that could be a pretty short period of time and might make it a little tougher to appoint somebody to a district board. Any concerns about that?
No, Mr. Chairman.
Secretary.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate it. It wasn't legal counsel. It was a call that I made because I lean towards having elections for elected officials. And I think I hear what you're saying. It is a balance. But I lean towards having an election for an elected official as soon as possible when you have an appointee. That's what I lean towards. And I think talking with clerks, I think there's some Many of them would like it to go the full period. A lot of them, while they would like it, understand that, let's get that thing up to the voters as soon as possible at the next director election. Again, I think it's a separate question. We just went back, we changed the wording a little bit, which I think is making it confusing, but right now I think it's actually a little confusing. We're going back to the status quo when they go up again. We're just trying to prevent an extension. That's all I'm trying to do here. And that I think is something that frankly we could really agree on, is not to have an extension. So if you want to go back to the stricken language on when it goes up again, I would not have a huge issue with it.
Okay.
Mr. Secretary, thank you.
Thank you.
Appreciate that clarification. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
You're welcome. Thank you both. Anybody, Senator Barlow.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I got a little bit confused in this. So I wonder if maybe the approach is getting in all of the new language, sticking with the current language, and just saying an appointee to the office of director shall not serve beyond the next regular election. That puts a time certain on their appointment, and the election is when you actually elect the successor director. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
And hold on, I totally agree with that, but is anybody hung up on the word regular election? And could we does it just mean the same to say the next election? And I realize there could be special elections, but is the regular really important? Because it's confusing. It sounds like there's another type of election. Anyway, Mr. Secretary, what do you think of that idea?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Barlow, I understand the intent of that. The way that I just heard it, and you might have to repeat it for me, is that if you appoint a director and they're an appointee, at that point, they would go until the next regular election. They would go until the next election. Under that reading, though, they would be prevented from either being appointed again or running again, because that's the appointee we're talking about. So if you stop it right there, then you're talking about that person, you're talking about that appointee. And then you're stopping it before going on. We're talking about an extension because it's kind of to speak to either a term ends and you're reappointed if there's no interest. And that speaks, I think, a little bit to Senator Landon's point. If there's no interest, there's a new election, there's a vacancy, assuming that the special district has, 4 out of 5 members and there's only 1 vacancy, the remaining directors get to choose because it's a vacancy that they will fill, but it's not an extension. What this gets at is you have an appointee, they cannot serve beyond the term of their appointment, which would be up until the next election. And then they can't serve anything beyond. So then that creates new problems. If you have no interest in it, that appointee is now just shut out of the process. So I think there might be some concerns with that language. I understand it, but I think.
So anybody time out for a sec, trying to go between the two here. Senator Barlow, what was it your intent that person couldn't either stand in the next election, or if no one filed, then they could be appointed again? Were they like excluded by your language?
Mr. Chairman, my intent was not to exclude anyone from appointment post-election or from being in election. It was only speaking to the term of the appointment itself.
So I
The
think
individual and the term they were appointed to. Thank you.
just to paraphrase, that means if you have someone that's appointed, even though it's a 4-year term but there's an election in 2 years, election in 18 months, that's going to be an open election in 18 months, irregardless of the regular staggered terms. And they would be allowed to stand for that election if they're qualified. And if no one is in the election and there's still a vacancy, they could be appointed. Is that your suggestion, Senator Barlow? Okay.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, and we can put clarifying language after that. Mr. Chairman, if I could, there are other statutes that we have where there's an appointee, and sometimes the end of the term or until their replacement is elected or otherwise appointed. So there are other places in statute where I think it maybe is more clear than this particular one. And I didn't think this one was going to be that challenging. So I did not spend that much time with it, but there are other, I think, examples in statute. We can probably get some existing language that would clarify what this is, what we're trying to accomplish here. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
You guys think that there's potential down this road? How about the committee? Is there potential down this road? Could we, is the committee okay if we just carry this bill over to the next meeting? And have Senator Barlow and Mr. Rubino and maybe anybody else that wants to join, come up with some language for us? Is that okay with you guys? Informal at that, just carry it over? Anybody object to that online or in the room? Okay, that's what we're gonna do. Thank you. And now I think it's you, Mr. Pepper. Right? Well, I can't tell if I'm ready or not, to be honest, but I think I am. And so this is you're presenting some proposed legislation that's not an LSO document.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. Glad to be here today. Appreciate the chairman doing a pretty good framing of the issues at your last meeting. I apologize that I was unable to attend the last meeting. But this came, a little background, this came about, and I'll try to be as fast as possible. This came about a few years ago. Some lawyers had come to me and had brought some specific language to my attention, which, without reading all of it, I'll do a bunch of numbers. Statutes 4110-128, 1812-120, and 157102C are the three statutes that I want to talk about. So currently, we have a ton of money. I don't think anybody in the room will disagree that we have aging infrastructure. Again, Mark Pepper, I apologize, Mark Pepper, Executive Director, Wyoming Association of Rural Water Systems. And I'm here representing about 220 special districts that own and operate water and wastewater facilities in the state, out of the 320 some community water and wastewater systems in the state. Which, if you do the math, that means only 96 of them are owned and operated by municipalities. The rest are all special districts. We have an unprecedented amount of money that's available for infrastructure improvements. And there isn't a system in the state of Wyoming that doesn't need a massive amount of infrastructure improvements, replacements, betterments, or otherwise. And so this came to my attention again about 3 years ago, and I started the process of talking with the legislature, with talking with SLIB, SRF, quite a few, some of the prior members of this committee who've since either moved on or on other committees. So what happened was, I think municipalities figured it out and the legislature figured it out, that the way that the statute 157102 was currently written for municipalities did not work with the SLIB timeframes on applications and deadlines for applications for various state spending programs. It didn't work with the federal programs. The lawyers in the room will know that in most cases, a lawyer for a district or a municipality has to write a letter saying that the entity has the ability to incur debt and has to sign off on how it was formed, what statutes it was formed under. And so I think the municipalities, and as is case sometimes, bills are brought and it goes through a particular statute and everybody assumes that it would apply to all governmental entities of some kind or other. And I think this is one of those cases. So what happened was you've got 157102C, and I'll read it in this sense. Where repayment of funds borrowed from the United States of America or from the state of Wyoming or from any subdivision, agency, or department of either is to be made solely from revenues generated by the enterprise with which the financed public improvement project is associated, and where security for the loan is restricted to a claim on the revenues generated from the enterprise with which the proposed public improvement project is associated, and to the assets of that enterprise. Any document evidencing the agreement to repay the borrowed funds shall not be considered a bond, and no bond election shall be required. Now, to preface that, or to give you the problem we've got, is then 1812-120. By resolution of its board, a district may submit to its qualified voters by a mail ballot or an election as determined by the Board of County Commissioners, the proposition of issuing bonds pursuant to this act to provide funds for the acquisition, construction, improving, or financing of improvements, as well as performing services for the benefit of the residents of the district, including any and all expenses incidental thereto. So if you go back to 15-7-102C, you see where the revenues generated by the enterprise, which we would think of as user fees or rates. If you're going to utilize those in a municipal setting to repay a debt, you no longer have to have an election of the people when you do those projects. And it's quite easy to move forward with the application processes, the deadlines, and so forth. Under 1812-120, that has to go to an election. Under 4110-128, the purpose of acquiring or improving a water or sewer system or other income producing project, provided that the bonds or other obligations shall be made available solely out of the net revenues derived from the operation of the system or other such project, blah, 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 shall be made payable solely out of the net revenues derived from the operation. No revenue bonds or other like securities shall be issued unless the issuance thereof has been submitted to a vote of the people. So the municipalities gained an advantage over the 220 special districts that own and operate water and wastewater operations. They have to go to a vote of the people first. Those votes sometimes don't match up with the application deadlines, and you have to wait until you actually have the project in hand. As the lawyers brought up, sometimes you can go to SLIB and SLIB will make changes to the project. And so if you'd had an election saying, we're going to go to SLIB and we're going to ask for this amount of money from this program, and here's the way we're going to set up the rates to repay it, so on and so on. And you get to SLIB and SLIB says, well, you know, I think water development could probably do some of that project. I think SRF could do some of that project. The project, the replacement of a water tower may be the same replacement of a water tower, but now the dollar amounts have all changed in terms of the rates. It may be that instead of some grant money, it became all loan money. And so now that would require a second vote of the population, because now it's a new deal. And if they vote it down, what do we do? The other issue that they brought up is that we have probably been utilizing 15-7-102C in special districts for quite some time. Nobody at SLIB can go back and tell me off the top of their head a special district that held an election prior to getting the debt. Now, a secondary issue is under the statutes, it talks about debt or other debt instruments or like instruments. That can also mean a grant. In the state of Wyoming, a lot of our grant programs have clawback provisions, which makes it a contingent liability and therefore a debt instrument, and it would probably require a vote of the people. So what I propose is that in 1812-120 and in 4110-128, I would propose that in 4110-128, we would amend adding a new paragraph B that in essence brings in the same language as 15-7-102C. notwithstanding subsection A of the statute or any provision of 22-21-101 through 22-21-112, which are the bond election statutes. For purposes of this section, where repayment of funds borrowed from the United States or a state payment made solely from revenues generated by the enterprise would not be considered a bond, and no bond election would be required. That'd be in the 41-10-128, a new B. In 1812, we would add a new A with the same scenario. What makes the elections a little bit difficult at times is that not only do we have to do a bond election pursuant to 22-21, but we also have to conduct that election pursuant to the special district election laws 22-29. So, and that requires, if we're going to try and make it to fit SLIB's application deadlines and whatnot, we would have to have a special election, which the election costs would be borne by the special district. Or we wait till the next general election and go through the county clerks and do that scenario of doing a special election or an election at a general election timeframe. So I think I would like to think that a couple decades ago, the municipalities figured it out and the legislature figured it out, and they created this exemption thinking it was extended to everyone. One of the problems I have right now is I know of at least 30 SLIB projects that the Secretary of State voted on in February that probably didn't have an election. So I worry that somewhere down the road, somebody pops up when the rate comes up, that they raise the rates to make the payments and so on and so forth. Somebody pops up and says, I never voted for that. And under the statute, they're right. And now we have a legal, we've got a legal problem that'll have to get solved in some form or fashion. I don't know what the remedy to that is. I'm not a lawyer. So that's my bill in a nutshell that I'd propose to you, that language, and would stand for any question.
I'm sorry, my mic was off. Questions for Mr. Pepper? Questions for Mr. Pepper? So, Mr. Pepper, did you consider limiting this exposure in any way? To say you don't need an election provided that the potential encumbrances are something relative to the size of the revenues of the district or something like that? I mean, that's one possibility. I don't know exactly how to do that. Thinking while I'm trying to fly here, but you know, if a little district takes on a gigantic encumbrance, that might be of concern. If they take on encumbrances that are modest, then we say, well, you don't need to have an election for that. Now, I just throw that out. I'm looking for other ideas. Mr. Pepper, any thoughts?
Yeah, if I may, thank you, Mr. Chairman. The statutes wouldn't allow for that unless we put language in there.
We'd have to
that
put
would-
language in.
And I'm not even sure how I'd write that. You know, I'm looking down the road at lead line replacements. I'm
Yep.
looking down the road at PFAS. Don't ask me to
Waste system
explain it.
replacements, yeah.
Yeah, I can't define PFAS. I just call it polyoxygen-free. There's going to be some treatment options that are going to come up that are extraordinarily expensive that, 92% of all the water and wastewater systems in the state of Wyoming serve populations under 500. So if you were to say any system under 500 that needs to do an improvement doesn't have to go to an election, that's not a bad deal. I could live with that because we're looking at 300 out of 320 would qualify. But I think adding the exemption language is probably the cleaner and more succinct way of making it stand.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Pepper. Questions for Mr. Pepper? Is there any public testimony on this proposal so far? Any public, stay with us. We need you as a thinking partner, I think. Anybody online? Okay, committee, this is not an LSO document. If, in order for us to consider it further, we'd have to have it put in LSO form for the next meeting. What are your thoughts on that? Senator Landon.
Mr. Chairman, first of all, I want to salute Mr. Pepper. Thanks for a really complete rundown and well done. You know, having been assured that we've done that years ago for our municipalities, it just seems important for this committee to consider all those special districts out there. I mean, it just makes sense that that we give them the opportunity to take advantage of the times. There's a lot of infrastructure money going to be available, and I hate to miss that opportunity for all those districts. So I would suggest, Mr. Chairman, if it's your thoughts as well, that we carry this forward. We may need an extra day on this third meeting, but that we could add this to the pile. I would, I guess, make that motion that we ask for a draft, get it drafted up officially from our professionals in the LSO and bring it to that third meeting.
Okay, any qualifications on that?
Second.
Got a second?
Mr. Chairman, to answer that question, you've touched on something that I wouldn't be prepared to really
Yeah.
pursue very far today, but I think I see where you're going. We don't want to get out over the tips of our skis. You know, on the other hand, we want to take full advantage, you know, for our districts out there. So
Sure.
we can be thinking about that as we.
We can think about amendments possibly. Is this an acceptable way forward for everybody? We okay? Okay, all those in favor of having this put into a draft form for discussion at our next meeting signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Okay, so we'll do that. Thank you, Mark. Good to see Mr. Pepper. All right, update from the Secretary of State's office. Are you guys ready? You had to wait all day. Go gather the flock. You could take a short break right now where the flock's being gathered. We'll take 10 minutes. We're gonna take 10 minutes. And I mean 4:40. take their places?
Can we stand for this?
Yeah, you can, if you're getting tired and want to stand, that's perfectly okay. Okay, I got 4:40. Let's come back to order. The last topic for consideration for today, and we're back tomorrow, is an update from the Secretary's State's office. And it's been a pleasure working with you today, Mr. Secretary. How's your office doing?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We are very well and appreciate this opportunity to update you on some of the activities within two of our divisions. We're going to have an update from the business division and then an update from the elections division. In the November meeting, we'd like to bring in compliance. That'll be in Cheyenne, if that's okay, just a brief thing. They have, business has a presentation and elections has a handout. So great. Thank you.
Take it away.
Go ahead.
All right, Mr. Chairman, this is Colin Crossman. I'm the director of the business division. I do have some slides. You may have the printout, but would you like them on the display as well?
For the people on, can we do that, Katie? Yeah, because there's probably no one looking right now, but there might be people online. Okay, go ahead.
Okay, so just in the interest of time, I'm going to go through this relatively quickly, but this is fairly similar to the presentation I made at the last meeting with updated numbers. As you know, the business division is responsible for all of the business filings. That's over 500,000 individual filings. It's actually closer to 590,000 or 590,000 for fiscal year 2023. And we're responsible for the intake of about 40 million, a little bit more than $40 million annually. Something that came up earlier this month, and this is on page 2 of the slides. Yep. A recent Forbes article put Wyoming as the #3 place to form your small business, with #1 being the state you currently live in. So kind of hard to beat that. And #2 is Delaware. So we're basically the #2 jurisdiction to form a small business. And of course, in Delaware, that's a lot of C corps. With Wyoming, it's primarily our LLC structure. We also, as you know, we oversee and audit our commercial registered agents. We have taken a renewed interest in that, given some of the concerns that people have expressed with filings that are not entirely on the level. The next page is the graph of new entity filings, excluding LLCs. As you can see, these are relatively flat. What I mean to show with this graph is that all of the growth that we see is with the LLC filings. The Wyoming LLC is the dominant entity that we see people forming from out of state. Although there is a little bit of growth in profit corps, as you might expect, it's nowhere near the volume of growth on the LLC side. I'm going to skip ahead 2 slides to the filings for Q2 of the year. Yep. This just shows what Q2 filing growth looks like over the equal time period from the previous years. Skipping ahead, I guess let's skip ahead 3 slides to statistics for fiscal year ending. This is kind of the I would call it the bottom line of what we're seeing. For fiscal year 2023, we see a over 27.5% growth year over year in filing. This is filing numbers, not revenue. That's massive. That eclipses all of the other years that I tracked here. And last year, 2022 versus 21 was only at a shocking growth of 18%. So we are growing very, very fast. In the last slide, I go through some of the numbers. So the last presentation I gave you only had numbers for quarters 1 through 3. So this is a full year. We are up almost 25% in revenue over 22 for 23. That should give you an understanding of just how fast and how much of the LLC growth we're seeing here. So bottom line, the growth is continuing and accelerating because of the favorable business climate that Wyoming has, specifically for LLCs. The business division is currently handling this growth but the growth is continuing and it appears to be accelerating. So there is that concern. We are proceeding with efficiency improvements, such as the improvement that I discussed at the last time, which was dealing with name checks. There's other improvements that we are attempting to implement. They will not be as impactful as the name checks, but we are doing what we can to adapt to the growth with the tools that we have. But that assuming that Wyoming continues to have a favorable business climate, I don't see that growth going away. So thank you very much.
Wow. Thank you very much, Mr. Crossman. Questions from the committee? Senator Scott. Microphone, Mr. Senator Scott.
Mr. Chairman,
Pull it up close.
question is, in your judgment, beyond just favorable business climate, what's causing our rapid growth? Have our competitors gotten greedy with their fees? Or is there something else going on?
Yes.
Mr. Crossman.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. One of the things is definitely that our chief competitor that we are often neck and neck with, which is Nevada, they did raise their fees more recently than we did. And the most recent fee increase that we did was relatively modest compared to what they did. So that is one of the elements. Another element, of course, is the impact of COVID and people forming small businesses at a higher rate than ever before. And couple those two things together, our relatively lower costs versus a state like Nevada or New Mexico, and the accelerated growth, we're, I believe, taking the lion's share of that growth.
Anybody else? Anybody else? Senator Barlow.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So in the filings, I mean, I have 3 entities registered with the Secretary of State's office, 2 of them active and 1 of them inactive. So in your data, can you actually see how many are basically inactive? They're, you know, when they file their filings, it's zeros and they pay the minimum fee. So do you have a sense of the percentage? This is not new filings, obviously. This is continuation filings. Do you have a sense of how many are there? Let's call them dormant, for lack of a better term, but existing but dormant. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Crossman.
Mr. Chairman, that is a number that we can generate. I don't have it on my readily available. At a first pass, I would say probably 70 to 80% of entities are filing the minimum $60, but that doesn't necessarily mean they're not active. That just means that they have under $300,000 of assets to determine.
Located in Wyoming.
Located in Wyoming, yes. Yeah. That does not mean that we couldn't figure out how many are filing full-on zeros for everything. That would be a much more in-depth analysis that's potentially possible. Yeah.
Anybody else? Senator Landon.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So thanks for the report. I'm just curious about the hidden impact to the office. Can you speak to that a little bit? These kind of numbers, some of that can be absorbed. What does it look like from a staff standpoint? What's the maintenance? What's the upkeep? And is that driving anything that we need to be aware of?
Mr. Crossman.
Yes, Mr. Chairman. We are fully staffed and we are handling the growth. As you know, there's a statutory 15 business day deadline to make sure everything is filed, and we are keeping well below that. The growth continuing like it is, it is apparently an exponential curve. And that does have me somewhat concerned with how that looks 3, 4, 5 years out. Will that mean that we need more staff potentially if that growth continues, or we don't have any other options such as technology or other things that mitigate that growth? Conversely, who knows what will happen in the broader global market? But I think that it's safe to say that with Wyoming the way it is, I think that a blip in the overall economic situation won't really slow our growth down that much.
Probably since you've found the state almost $9 million more dollars, we could probably shake a little bit loose to help you out with your staffing issues, I would imagine.
Mr. Chairman, if you.
Go ahead, Mr. Secretary.
Thank you. Thank you. A couple things on this. We're about to submit our budget. We're not asking for any more positions this time. You know me, I mean, from the legislature, I'm one of the, I want to be to the bone. I want us to get the job done, but we're not going to be in any way wasteful. We are looking also at a new program for our business filings that would be more efficient, also allow amendments, and that would greatly decrease the need for potential staff in the future. If that appropriation does not occur in this session, at some point we would need one, probably soon after the expiration of the upcoming biennium, at the rate we're on.
Finally, thank you, Mr. Secretary. for that good news.
Thank you very much. Any other questions? I have a question. This sounds really great, but I'm always like kind of suspicious. There's been a lot of world upheaval in the past, more than a year now, and money moving around the globe. Is that part of what's driving this? Are a lot of these new filings on the shelf corporations where somebody's going to resell them? Just speculation, because it's good to be business friendly. I think there's a dark side to being too business friendly, and I'm trying to figure out where we are on that continuum.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, that is happening. That's happening not just in Wyoming, it's happening in every state. Determining how much of that we are seeing and how much of the share of our growth is very, very, very hard. So one of our attempts to mitigate that is making sure the commercial registered agents are keeping the records that they are mandated by our statutes to keep. And so that is one of the reasons why we have stepped up some enforcement on making sure of that, doing audits and doing other such things. I definitely believe that we should be fully enforcing the rules that we have to make sure that they're being followed. But yes, I think that some of our growth is due to that. I don't know how much. I wouldn't even speculate that it's the majority of the growth. I think it's probably on a pace with some of the other states. But because our growth is so much faster, maybe we have a little more, maybe we don't. But because of the, as Senator Barlow had said earlier, because of the way we have that 300,000 Wyoming asset minimum, it is very difficult to tell what is a entity that is operating 100% out of state, what is an entity that is fully on the shelf, and what is an entity that just isn't profitable.
That's fair enough. Mr. Chairman, go ahead, Mr. Secretary.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I've worked with you on a couple individual pieces of legislation and trying to get a handle on some of these issues, and was definitely supportive of having an interim topic. It didn't make the cut, and I understand for a budget session and there are other priorities as well, but would welcome working with you, any members of the committee and the committee itself, for trying to get a handle on some of these issues that we've seen. And I have directed them. We've ramped up our CRA audits quite a bit, and we've had a couple that have identified some problems.
Thank you. Anybody else? So I think that's a good deal, and look forward, maybe next interim we'll take something up. One other question. Wyoming now has a chancery court. Do you see any connection to the chancery court in terms of business filings in Wyoming? I don't think the court's that active, but I don't know that they're not. I actually don't know anything about that, but what do you think?
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. We have that digital asset registry bill. We've got the rulemaking that's going to go into effect here pursuant to state statute here towards the end of the year. I believe it's December 1. Yes. December 1. And we're fully up on that. It's going to be up on our site. I think that the premise of that was that people were going to incorporate in Wyoming or register their digital asset, and we'd get this line of precedent in the Chancery Court. As I've testified, I'm personally skeptical. I think that Chancery Court, I'm skeptical about being able to build that up, but I'm not sure on the activity as well. I think there's a lot of dreams on that. And like any field of dreams, I mean, there's that potential of hitting the jackpot there. But I'd say the higher percentage chances that it wouldn't play out, but that's all opinion.
Yeah. So and Mr. Secretary, the Chancery Court is not completely tied to the new financial instruments and virtual assets, but I think we were hoping it would be good old fashioned and develop a body of law, not hoping to surpass Delaware, but to begin to do what Delaware did in terms of having this tremendous body of interpretations in law. I don't know if we're getting there or not. That might be something we'll get a briefing on at the next session or through the Judiciary Committee. Mr. Chairman.
Well, Mr. Chairman, thank you. And everything stated is absolutely true. We are looking at that, monitoring, hearing from the Chief Justice. There are 2 or 3 of us on the Judiciary Committee who also serve on this one. And no, it's not as active as I think some of the hopes were. But there is enough activity that they're covering with a couple of judges, and it's just not standing up all the way at this point. And so there hadn't been any requests for additional personnel or whatever. So we'll just have to see. I think the framework is good. And it certainly gives us some opportunities. We'll just have to see as we go forward. But I know the Judiciary Committee will be keeping an eye on that. So
Thank you. Anybody else? Any questions on the business environment? Mr. Secretary, back to you. What else you got?
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll turn it over to the elections. I want to reiterate, I will go back to those discussions on Chancery Court and supported it. And I think over time, I personally got a little more skeptical, but I certainly respect the will of the legislature on that. And we're going to do everything we're standing up that digital asset registry, and hopefully it brings in a lot here in coordination with that line of precedent that they're going to have in that. So thank you.
Thank you, sir. And Mr. Young.
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, thank you for your time today. My name is CJ Young, and I am the Director of the Elections Division at the Secretary of State's office. So I have just I'm going to try and keep it pretty quick for you all and then save time for questions here. I have a few general updates. The first update has to do with the handout that went around. My apologies, we didn't get this to you a little sooner. We ended up, this was still hot off the press last night at 5:30 p.m. So we were working on it to the last minute to get some stuff for you all, but we'll have it to you sooner next time. Essentially what this is we wanted to start delivering an update to you all and generally to the legislature regarding some of the updates we do for our voter registration and system maintenance. It just kind of gives a little update if you're curious about what we've been working on, how things are being updated or implemented, because the technology is such a big piece of what we do in elections. And we work very closely with the technology division at the Secretary of State's office. One I did want to point out, because I've heard from feedback from many folks that this will be popular among you all. We are making everything more mobile friendly. So you'll be able to file things on your phone while on the campaign trail, reports, things like that. So we're working to make all of our pretty much everything more mobile friendly. And then there's some other general updates. I'd be happy to answer any questions about our updates, but to our technology systems here. Other general updates for you from the elections division. Recently, we participated in a tabletop the vote exercise that was with the Cyber Infrastructure and Security Agency called CISA. It's part of Homeland Security. We were on with 1,800 other people from all over the nation, law enforcement, experts in elections, other Secretary of State's office, and we looked at what are potential threats to elections and how do we respond to those appropriately. And so that's something that we were very excited to take part of. We were joined by local clerks as well, who were able to join us for that meeting and help participate in that process. Additionally, the elections division, we continue to work to provide as much outreach to the community as possible. Just a couple months ago, we went and spoke to some new incoming students at the University of Wyoming about how elections work in Wyoming. And we always want to make sure that we have an open door policy in the elections division for anybody that wants to visit in person or ask us any questions. So that's really big for us. Let's see, moving on. Just briefly, wanted to update you all on Senate File 120 or the restoration of rights. That is something that we have worked very closely with Department of Corrections on to make sure that it's, implemented. We're tracking that data. Again, it connects back to that technology piece. We also are the repository and statute of those certificates. Those certificates have been coming in. We have several hundred already since the bill came in effect on July 1 that are in the office and filed with the Secretary of State's office. Again, with my old connections with Department of Corrections, I stay fairly in contact with folks there. They do tend to receive a fairly decent number every week. So those applications continue to come in for those restoration of rights. And really at that, I don't want to burn up any more of your time. I'd stand for any questions you might have of the Elections Division.
Thank you very much, Mr. Young. Questions, Senator Landon, then Senator Scott.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just real quickly, I missed the number. The restoration of rights is something we dealt with during the session. I'm just curious if you could repeat that.
Yes,
Mr. Young.
Mr. Chairman, currently I didn't have the exact number. We're around 300 or so. We're generally getting them in batches of about 40 to 60 when they come in from the Department of Corrections. They've been coming in weekly. And again, talking to DOC, I know that they're getting 20 to 30 a week pretty normally as far as applications coming in. And there's really two different types of applications we're getting. Certificates we're getting. They're coming from two main sources. One is going to be folks that are putting in an application. They had a felony in the past. They want to get their rights restored. And when those certificates are issued, they have that the voting rights are restored immediately. And the 5-year date is there for the remaining rights. Although many folks, they're already long past that 5 years. So those rights are effectively effective immediately. And those rights are granted via statute. The statute gives them the right. All DOC is doing is checking all the boxes and making sure everything looks correct and then giving that certificate for ease. The other type of certificate that is getting issued and that would be filed with us from this point going forward are those folks that are successfully completing probation or parole or completing their prison sentence. And they're eligible for that based on their felony. And once they leave the custody of the DOC, if they meet all the eligibility requirements, they're receiving that certificate as well. So those are coming together in a batch of both the applications and the folks that are finishing up their sentences.
Appreciate it. Thank you.
And Mr. Young, that was based on legislation that was effective July 1, right?
Yes, there's two pieces here at play. The first one is the original voting rights restoration, which took effect on July 1st of 2017.
Okay.
And then the restoration of the remaining rights, what we generally coined it as the remaining rights, came into effect this past July as part of Senate File 120.
I think Senator Barlow might have had something to do with that. Senator Scott, did you have a question?
Mr. Chairman, really, I have an appeal to the Secretary of State's.
Are you trying to get your
office.
rights back, sir?
No, it looks to me like, from my perspective, all the employees there are quite young and therefore know all about computer systems and apps and all that sort of thing.
Look at all.
And on behalf of those of us who are a little older and maybe don't work in a business that requires that sort of thing, some of us are going to ask you for help that you think is pretty elementary. Everybody ought to know. And I'm just asking you to be indulgent and give us the help as we try to use some of your systems, because we will need some help.
Mr. Young.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Scott, absolutely. We're always happy to help anytime. You call us any day you need us. Or anyone open to anybody who needs us. We always are happy. We have additional staff in elections as well as the technology division, and we already do field phone calls really on a daily basis. Sometimes it can be a password reset. How do they find something, or just general questions? And so I know customer service is a big focus for the secretary. It's a focus for me as well as all the division chiefs. And so that's something we really pride ourselves on, is maintaining really strong customer service to our citizens and stakeholders.
Thank you, sir. Anybody else? Any other questions for the Secretary of State's
Well,
office?
and Mr. Chair, I want to add
Oh,
one thing.
Go ahead, Ms. Secretary. and then
Just
we'll
want
get
to
Mr. Yan.
invite Senator Scott or anybody out there listening, any citizen, I'm available 24/7. My cell is 251-1372. And if you have any feedback on your experience, and then when you call in to get that password or anything that comes up, password reset or anything, just would be happy to talk with you about that and any feedback you have. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Representative Yen.
Mr. Chairman, thank you, Secretary of State and maybe CJ as well. Does it make sense for us I think the chair has mentioned this a couple of times, that organization that's made up of a whole bunch of different states' election administrators. They've gotten together so people can double check whether people are double voting in multiple states. I think Wyoming is actually not a member of that organization. Does it make sense for us to join that so we can make sure that people don't double vote in Wyoming?
Ms. Secretary, is that through you?
Appreciate it, Mr. Chairman. Thank you. Representative Yin, ERIC, Wyoming has never been a member of ERIC. Many states have withdrawn from ERIC due to concerns about privacy of the data and the direction of the board. Since then, there has been another effort that has cropped up to have sharing of data from state to state with MOUs between states. And that I think is something that is of more interest to secretaries across the nation, and I think a better direction than going through a third-party board that there's no accountability on, and there's some concern about privacy of the data and also the political direction of that board. It is very important that that data is protected. And so ERIC, I think is on the downslope. I mean, once you have enough states that don't participate, the data becomes less and less useful, right? So now I think the direction is to have MOUs from state to state and have that understanding through the election administration officials that the data that we're going to have privacy around the data, and that it's not a third-party board that isn't elected. Thank you.
Follow up. Microphone.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. Secretary, would you need any authorizing legislation to be able to make those MOUs with multiple states? Because I think it's a worthwhile thing to make sure that we don't have people double voting.
Mr. Secretary.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We believe the authority is there. If you want to, if there's any questions I need to answer on that in the future, we can examine it a little more. We've had some initial discussions. We've not entered into any yet. But initially our readout was that the authority is there.
Anybody else? Senator Barlow.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I actually, when we were talking through the bills earlier, crossover voting, and anyway, the whole suite of bills that we talked about with voting and residency, et cetera, that came to me as well. So I'm going to go to a little different. Is this a place where a compact would actually make sense? A compact in the states, between the states, because then you actually have a place in the governance of the organization and you can have some uniformity. I just throw that out there as maybe you don't have to comment on it, but I throw that out there in the broadest sense that maybe there's a place for something like that. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Barlow. Anybody else? Senator Landon.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, not to belabor and keep us too late, but one of the things that was sort of an underlying topic all day long is this reporting mechanism, the money that is coming into a lot of our Wyoming elections now, more and more all the time. And I'm just wondering, how much time have you been able to spend on that front? And knowing that we have an election coming up real soon, I'm just wondering if you have any recommendations to us as to how we can either put more teeth into the statutes or do something a little bit differently so that you can monitor. And then finally, just a question of what do we do about these races, and are you confident that everyone's reporting what's going on out there?
I think that's for the Secretary, Mr. Secretary.
Well, Mr. Chairman, we have worked quite a bit on our YCFA system. Again, it was in the written update. You're going to see a redesign there. All the data remains on there, but you're going to see a redesign that's going to launch here by the end of the year. You know, I was just reviewing some of the renderings on it, and I think we're there on the font and everything. And I think it looks good. But, you know, one of the main reasons it was put on the schedule was to make it mobile friendly. And that's on YCFIS, our campaign finance, as well as the candidate filing system. We're going to add a question in line with when rights were restored on the registration form for voting in 2017. We're going to add a question on the filing system. Have your rights been restored? It's going to be 3 options. Either you're not a felon, you're a felon and your rights have been restored, or you're a felon and your rights have not been restored. That's going to help us in identifying some. There's a lot of nuance in the way the statute's worded, as I know Senator Barlow knows, as to you know, some of these situations where someone might think their rights have been restored and they have not been. We're a little concerned. I mean, we want to make sure when we certify the list that it's indeed everybody is eligible, because the nightmare, right, is you get in a situation where you certified a list and either after the election or right before we find it, you know, someone submits a complaint or something and we learn they're not eligible. So we want to try to button that up a little bit. Getting back to your question though, I mean, I think our YCFIS system is very strong. When there are complaints that you know, when the prosecutors have a referral, I think the issue is that very rarely is that prosecuted, and that gets to the prosecutors and back to some of the discussions in the morning. So.
Okay, anybody else? Anybody else? Mr. Secretary, thanks for your courtesies today. It's been, be safe travels home. And where you guys staying over?
Mr. Chairman, I think we're gonna, I'm going up to that hearing, and then tomorrow I might testify virtually if with your you know, on the proposed rate increase. We have submitted a comment in line, you know, because we are the Secretary of State, on some of the effect on business and families in our state. So we might comment tomorrow on that if you mind remotely, but
no, go right
there's
ahead.
no elections issues up. So we were not planning on being here in person.
Safe travels home.
Okay. Do you want us to be here in person? I mean, we
No, I
Okay.
think that'll be fine. There'll be a lot of people wanting to testify tomorrow. We haven't allotted enough time for it. So virtual and fast is probably the best.
Okay.
Thank you. Safe travels. Good to see all of you.
Thank you.
Now we would open it up to general public comment. General public comment that would have the committee's ear. Anybody in the room? Anybody in the room? Is there anybody online that would like to offer general public comment? Okay. I think, and our start time tomorrow morning is also 8:30. Is that correct? We're adjourned till tomorrow morning.
9:30?
8:30.